Vern. My name's Jade Scotton, and I think you probably already know who I am. I look a lot like my mom. One of my biggest questions for you is why did you just disappear out of my life? You and my mom were really, really close, and I don't understand why you just vanished and you never cared about my well-being. I tried to reach out and I never gotten any response. And so it would help me understand better if you could explain to me why you just left.
When Evil Lives Here started with looking through the details of my mother's case, and I found out that you were interviewing Vern Jensen, I was a bit suspicious because he was my mom's boyfriend, and I haven't seen Vern since I was around 4. After my mom died, he just vanished with her. Why did I see Vern again? I had a lot of resentment towards him and anger. When I got in contact with Evil Lives Here, they had brought up the idea of, what if you could get those questions that you have for Vern answered?
Oh. Give me a break. It's a fair question. These are fair questions. She has the right to know. She's entitled to answer to these questions.
I have so much I want to ask Vern. My whole life, I lived with asking why. Why did he just leave? Why did this happen? Why me? Why my mother? I thought I'd done something wrong.
I hope someday, we get the opportunity to discuss these questions face to face. Let's talk.
September 9th, 1999 is when my mom was killed. Every September, I always start feeling very uneasy. So it's always kind of been there in my mind, just a part of me, I think. What happened to our family was really a tragedy. And I was so young when the case had happened that a lot of the investigator team and whatnot hadn't ever really kept me in the loop. And so what I have always really struggled with was not knowing everything that went on in that day. I had foggy memories and a jumble of what people had told me, but I felt like I was the reason she died, that I somehow contributed. After Vern filmed for the Evil Lives Here show, the film director, I gave her my number and I said, if he wants to talk to me, he can call me, and he did. And we talked for a couple of hours. It was a long conversation. It was really, really amazing. It was really good. I am nervous to see Vern again. I have no idea what's gonna happen in that moment.
Diane and I started out as friends in high school. We met at the very beginning of our sophomore year, and we quickly just had a connection and became very good friends. I ended up in the foster care system. Diane and the Rays opened their home to me and asked if I wanted to be adopted. And I did. And from that day on, we've been sisters. They are my parents, as much as my blood relatives are. The guilt comes from not being able to save her. She was taken so quickly.
On September 9th of 1999, the police and EMS were summoned over to Diane Ray's apartment. There was no signs of forced entry. There was no obvious signs that any real struggle had taken place. Diane was found in her bedroom on the floor next to her bed. There was a meth syringe found by Diane's body. They'd found needle marks on Diane's arm, and it was consistent with methamphetamine use. During that time in Twin Falls, meth had really sprung up and had become huge in our area. They were cooking meth all over. It wasn't hard to go out and get it. This case looked like a drug overdose.
Were you at home today? With your mom?
Yes, and her is dead.
Really, I'm sorry.
Yes, but the big boy did it.
The big boy did it? What big boy?
I don't know what his name is.
Was there one boy?
3 boys.
3 boys?
They rolled over the floor. And my mom told them to get out. Were them grown-ups? Or kids? Or what? Grown-ups. Grown-ups? Yeah. They'll kill my mom.
It's really hard to watch. How she says that people came in and killed her mom. It's just heartbreaking. It really is. It leaves a hole in you. This case was difficult from the beginning because when kids speak, you just have to be able to decipher if what they're talking about is in reality or if it's make-believe. We didn't have all the telltale signs of a normal homicide. We didn't have forced entry. We didn't have what appeared to be any sort of fighting that went on in the house. There was no indication other than the drugs that were in her purse and her having needle marks on her arms, that anything other than she ingested methamphetamine and it killed her.
Diane was very pretty, very vivacious, and she just had that personality that was just almost like a magnet to people. When it was Diane and Jade, she was still looking for that relationship. She really wanted somebody that she could love, that would be happy when she got home, and also be a father figure in their life. She had met somebody through her work that she really wanted to get to know. The person she met at work was Vern. She said, he is wonderful, he treats me wonderful, he wants to be a father figure to my kids and help me raise them. And I knew that was what was most important to her. But there was a time where I did put partial blame on Vern Jensen for Diane's death.
Before my mom moved in with Vern, our life was very all over the place. But with Vern, it felt like everything kind of fell into rhythm and that I could always expect to wake up there. It was just warm and comfortable, and I think how a childhood should be. I really saw Vern as a father figure. I felt very safe around him. I hadn't witnessed my mom that happy, I don't think, at all before. The memories that I have are almost, they're like videos that play in my mind, but they're very faded, almost like an old projector film. On the day my mother died, I remember either a doorbell or a knock at the door. And she answered the door. And I don't remember much about that interaction at the door, but I remember the three strangers kind of pushing and forcing my mother to the bedroom. I remember a gun. There was yelling, and I think she was crying maybe. And I remember just that feeling of anxiety and scared and a lot of confusion on my end. And then one of them came and talked with me. They asked what I liked to do or if I had toys that I liked to play with. And I remember becoming very excited, thinking that they were there to play with me. I showed her my toys. And then I remember hearing my mom calling for me. They brought me to the doorway, and I remember her on the bed. And I remember her just repeating, "I love you so much. You need to know that. You need to tell them that I love them," talking about my siblings and saying, she said each of their names, and she said, "I love them." But the one thing I know that she was sure of is that she was dying, and knowing that death was so imminent and being able to compose to get her message to me, it's just a strength that I don't think many people would have. I thought, she was sleeping. She wouldn't wake up, and I tried to roll her over. I thought I'd done something wrong. And then the phone rang, and that was Vern calling. And I remember telling him that she won't wake up. And I remember him sounding panicked at one point and saying he would be there. I don't remember seeing Vern ever again after that. I remember feeling like he was going to be my father, and then he was just gone, and I felt abandoned. Why did I see Vern again? I had a lot of resentment towards him and anger. I remember asking about him, and my grandmother saying, "Well, he's not around anymore, and you're not going to see him anymore." And I had a lot of questions for Vern. When I got in contact with Evil Lives Here, they had brought up the idea of, what if you could get those questions that you have for Vern answered? I felt like if I didn't do it, then I would never get the answers.
It was just disbelief. It was no way. I'm like, how does a 34-year-old die? And I remember thinking that I needed to get to her and to get there as quick as I could. Excuse me. You would think after 22 years that talking about it would be easier, but it really isn't. That hole is still there, that emptiness is still there, and the hurt is still there. At that time, the police had said that she had died from a drug overdose, the drug being methamphetamines. And I remember thinking, no, that's not true. They knew my sister, and I would have known. My dad and I were able to go to her apartment and clean out her effects. I remember finding wadded up Kleenex and toilet paper around the bed where they found her. I picked one up, and I'm not sure why, but I smelled it, and it smelled like rubbing alcohol. When I smelled it, for a split second, I thought, oh my gosh, Diane, are you really shooting up? Are you using that to clean the area? There's that part of your brain that goes, okay, this is hard evidence. People can keep secrets. One of the detectives was still out there, and I said, can I ask you some questions? And he said I could, and I said, did you find track marks on her arms? And he said, I did. I found 2. She had a track mark in her left and her right arm. Right then, I knew something was wrong because Diane was right-handed. She couldn't even hardly hold a fork in her left hand. There's no way. And at that point, he looked at my dad and I and said, you people never want to believe that your children are capable of these kind of things. He said, but I'm telling you they are. She was, and she's dead. I said, there's something wrong here. I know in my heart that this isn't right.
Jade, how did your mommy get there? Somebody came in the house and rolled over the floor. They rolled over the floor? And killed my mom. After we stepped in the well, we killed my mom.
I worked as hard as I could to explain what I had seen and that I had tried to give them as much as I could give them. Somebody came in, somebody did this to her. It should have been very obvious. Why was it ruled and just an overdose, and why was it looked at as not homicide for so long?
My mom told me that. Forever always will be in my heart. Did your mom tell you something else? No, her own talking. Her dad.
Did her tell you something before her got dead?
No.
What'd she tell you?
She told me her will be in my heart.
Okay.
Her will be here someday.
I'm so sorry. I was so little. Yeah, it was difficult.
You said that you're going through a divorce now.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you getting divorced from?
Vicki Arlene Jensen. She hated Diane. Used to call Diane. Diane said, Vicki's going to try one more thing to try and break us up.
Vern was convinced that Diane's death was not an accidental drug overdose. He was convinced that Vicki had something to do with it. On a typical drug overdose, you don't have people coming up saying that we suspect that that person was murdered. Vicki Jensen's initial response to having investigators talk to her was that, yeah, she had disagreements with Diane, but She wouldn't have killed her, and she was working that day, and there would be no possibility for her to have done it. Neighbors didn't see anybody matching that description. There wasn't any information that was given to us that we went, yeah, she's the one that did it. We had Jade's statement that there were people in the house that wrestled with Mommy. But at the time she gave it, it was hard to know what to do with it. There wasn't anything that we could put our hands on that we went, a murder has taken place and we can prove it. There was a meth syringe found by Diane's body, and it was in her purse. At the end of the day, after looking at all the evidence, it was just a tragic death, and methamphetamine was used, and it was more than likely an accidental overdose.
Our family decided to have a closed casket. Somebody brought Jade in, and I picked her up and was carrying her around, and she said, I want to go to the box. So we walked over to her casket, and she said, my mommy is in that box. And she said, my mommy's an angel. And I said, she absolutely is. And she asked me, if my mommy's an angel, how come she's in the box? How is she going to get out of that box? And the only thing I could think to tell her was that that's the special thing about angels, is that whether a box is closed or not, angels always go to heaven. And that's just the magic of being an angel. And she seemed to accept that okay. But it absolutely was heartbreaking. I overheard some family and friends talking about what we had found at the apartment. I said, I don't understand all the watered up Kleenex and tissues. And I still had Jade on my hip. And she said, those were for Mommy. She said, the bad people came and Mommy had owies, and I tried to fix Mommy. And she had been going to the bathroom and getting Kleenexes and toilet paper, trying to help Mommy's owies and make her wake up. It was just all the more information for me that said, no, this is not right. Something has happened here. I really was in a fragile state of mind. I couldn't sleep and I couldn't rest. This sleep deprivation and the feeling of having to find out the truth for Diane lasted for months. Into the end of February, I decided to call up Twin Falls Police Department. I wanted to know if they had closed her case or if it was still open. He said, we do have a person of interest that we would like to talk to about your sister's case. And I remember just getting teary and saying, thank God. Thank God they did not let this go. It was almost like a weight lifted. Not all of the weight, but at least some of it going, oh my gosh, so there's hope.
In February of 2000, I had been made aware that there was a tip that had come in, and I was interested in following up that tip to see if it led anywhere. A gal from out of state had called in and had reported that her friend, Autumn Pauls, had been involved in a murder. She's 14 when this happens. She's in junior high school. The tip was that Autumn had taken Jade, the 3-year-old child, into another room while the murder was taking place. Turns out that Autumn Pauls was the niece of Vicki Jensen. We went out and made contact with Autumn. Autumn was saying that no, she didn't have anything to do with it. But when I confronted her on what the witness had said, that Autumn had taken Jade into the bedroom, and Autumn immediately said,
I think my Aunt Vicki is guilty.
for the first time in this case, we actually had evidence that somebody had done something criminal. This is a death investigation that stinks to high heaven.
Tell me what happened.
We planned on going over there.
And doing what?
And I was gonna have nothing to do with it. But my Aunt Vicki was gonna kill Diane.
Okay.
My Aunt Vicki and Matt, they held her down, and I don't know what happened.
What was the plan?
We were supposed to go over there and get into the house and shoot her with something.
Did you ever see a needle or anything?
I didn't see it. I was in the other room.
Okay.
They were planning on giving Diane insulin that would kill her and then methamphetamine that would cover it up. In all the cases that I've worked, I've never worked a case where they've staged an overdose to cover up a murder. The moment that happened, we have a murder scene that now makes sense because we have 2 injections on Diane's arm. A murder scene that makes more sense when Jade says 3 people came in and wrestled with Mommy.
When me and Vicki walk in, and Diana starts screaming, and then Vicki rushes past Autumn and like grabs hold of Diane, and she goes into the other room, gets Diane down. I held her wrist where the needle was supposed to go in, and Vicki shoots it in.
Okay.
Then after she lays there for a while, like this was a long time.
Did she quiet down after the shot was being
Yeah,
made?
she quieted down because she knew that she knew that there was no way around it, and her daughter was there. That was. She laid there and Vicki was like, "Why ain't this? You know, it ain't working." We were there for over 45 minutes, and as much and whatever the insulin that she gave her, Vicki figured that she'd die in like 10 minutes, and she just stood there, and we had to wait there, and finally she just started like breathing funny, and we waited there until she turned blue and her lips were blue.
How many shots did Vicki give her?
1 of the crank and 1 of the insulin.
So she gave her 2 shots. She gave her 2 shots.
Yeah.
Matt, out of all 3, was forthcoming. It didn't take much when we showed up at Matt's place.
Do you regret what you did? Yeah.
Every day, ever since it happened.
And do you understand that if you took somebody's life, does that bother you?
Yeah, it bothers me a lot.
Autumn Pauls and Matt Pearson, they took steps to end Diane's life. It was all under the direction of Vicki, and without Vicki being an influence in their life, I believe that would have never happened. But it did. At least Matt had some remorse and was accurate and forthcoming with the information once he knew that the jig was up.
What was in this for you, Matt? Why did you do this?
Autumn kind of told me that we would get back together,
She told you if you did this, that there would be a chance of you guys getting back together. And
Yeah. I was in love with Autumn. And I'd do anything for somebody I loved.
Matt did this heinous act for a 14-year-old girl that he wanted to be with. And he didn't think that was too high of a price. It speaks to Vicky's ability to manipulate people. She was able to have them trade everything for nothing.
I know that you had formulated a plan to kill her a while ago, and you told people about that. I know.
Yeah, but I didn't do it.
So what I need from you is for you to be honest with me.
There, I don't know a thing about it. I'm telling you the honest truth. I don't know a thing about it. I got up in the morning, got my friend off for school.
Vicky,
At 7:30 in the morning.
Vicky, just a second. Okay, when I tell you that I know that you were there, I know that you were there. I've already talked with Autumn.
She knew that her time was up, and immediately she invoked her rights and wanted an attorney. And I told her I think that was probably a pretty good idea.
I find it all very difficult. It's unlike anything I've experienced watching this as an adult and seeing it with adult eyes. I was surprised she tried to deny it as long as she did. And her composure didn't break. There was nothing. It really speaks to what she is as a person and how she lost that bit of humanity and that she is evil. It really helps kind of the picture become more clear and focused, where it was so foggy and stuff before. It's my story being unfolded.
Hello, Vern. My name is Jade Scotton, and I think you probably already know who I am. I look a lot like my mom. One of my biggest questions for you is, why did you just disappear out of my life? I don't understand why you just vanished. It would help me understand better if you could explain to me why you just left.
I'm sorry you feel like I abandoned you. That was never my intent, Jade. But I really felt like that if I stayed in your life, it would be more of a reminder of what had happened. Please forgive me. I'm sorry I failed you. Sorry I failed your mom. But more than that, I'm sorry that you feel like I didn't care enough for her to protect her, because I would have. Give me a break. It's a fair question. These are fair questions. She has the right to know. She's entitled to answer to these questions.
It's really powerful. I think you can see a lot of the regret and shame and guilt on his face, and it definitely hurt him, but he was still very brave to answer those questions, even though I knew they were hard questions. And I have a lot of respect for that.
She was just a little 3.5, almost 4-year-old girl last time I saw her. I wasn't there for her. I don't want to let her down again. I don't want to disappoint her.
I was down at a daycare helping out a friend, and I got a phone call from my husband. And he said, "You need to sit down." He said, "I just got a call from the detective, and they have arrested 3 people for the murder of your sister." I just remember breaking down at work and my friend hugging me and me telling her, and she said, "You were right. You knew all along." And I said, I thought I was crazy. I thought I was losing my mind.
As they left, Vicki wanted to go back and make sure that there wasn't any witnesses. She wanted to go back and kill Jade. She did the ultimate harm, and she wanted to do more harm. Matt told me that he said that he would not go back. Matt and Autumn stopped her. The kids went, "No, we're not doing it." Vicki Jensen almost got away with murder. If you passed her in the grocery store, you wouldn't think anything of it. But evil does come in all forms. Vicki Jensen was facing life without possibility of parole, or the state was going to ask to execute her. But at the end, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder without possibility of parole. Both Autumn and Matt were sentenced to jail for first-degree murder, and since they have been released.
I wanted all of them life without chance of parole or the death penalty. I truly believe that both Autumn and Matthew are fully capable of murdering again. There were plenty of opportunities for any of them to say, you know, she's really going to do this. I don't want to be part of it. It takes a specific kind of person to carry out something like this. After Diane passed, I did let family know that I would be happy to finish raising Jade on Diane's behalf. But Mom said, no, I'm going to keep her. All she had left was that grandchild, and I would have clung to her as well. Absolutely. I just feel so much for Jade. She went through so much that is just something a child should never have to go through. Oh my goodness. Such a cute little girl. Jade, she lost that little sparkle in her eye and the smile and the contentment. But she is finding her place in life now. She is growing into who she is. When she had her son, that spark started to come back. And being a mother and finally getting some answers and having a little more memory of the day that she lost her mom and being able to work through that, that spark is starting to come back. And not only is the spark coming back, but a level of confidence that I haven't seen in a long, long time. She's a strong girl.
There was a lot of fear in my journey of healing, and one thing that I want to make so clear is that healing is the hardest and the most painful thing, but it is a marathon, and eventually you get to a point where you feel like you can look back on that whole journey and say, wow, I've overcome so much.
God.
Hi. It's been a very long time.
You look so much like your mom. It's scary.
I've heard that a lot.
It's been so hard to kind of relive all this stuff because, Jade, I want you to know one thing. I love your mother very much. In 1999, after she passed,
the scorching heat of the Arizona desert does not melt away secrets. It bakes them into the cracked, dusty earth, locking them beneath a blinding glare until the past becomes as hard and unyielding as stone. It is October 1991, and the neon lights of Central Phoenix are flickering against a purple desert twilight, casting long, distorted shadows across an asphalt landscape that radiates the suffocating remains of a 100-degree day. In a quiet, middle-class neighborhood near Camelback Mountain, the evening routine is shattered in a single, silent heartbeat. 22-year-old Laura Vance, a brilliant young legal clerk with a future mapped out in corporate boardrooms, steps out of her apartment to grab a binder from her car. She never returns. Her keys are left glinting on the hot gravel pavement, her driver's side door swings open like a broken wing, and her baseline security vanishes into the dry desert wind without a single cry, without a single witness, and without a trace. For 35 years, this frozen mystery remained a hollow wound in the chest of the city, a classic cold case that resisted the desperate efforts of generations of investigators who watched the trail turn entirely to dust. The police files grew yellow, the original detectives retired or went to their graves, and the community slowly wrapped itself in the comforting delusion that the monster who took Laura had long since crossed the state line or dissolved into the vast expanse of the American Southwest. They were completely wrong. The darkness was patient, resting comfortably in the ordinary routine of a suburban life, shielded by an absolute wall of 35-year silence that everyone believed would never be breached. But in the sweltering summer of 2026, a single, untraceable phone call cuts through the digital static of the Phoenix Police Department's cold case hotline, an anonymous tip containing a sequence of highly specific details that no outsider could possibly know. A single voice that shatters a multi-decade illusion and triggers a lightning-fast forensic offensive that will finally drag a hidden predator out of the suburban shadows and into the unyielding light of absolute justice. To fully comprehend the shocking velocity of this breakthrough, you have to thrust yourself back into the raw, analog atmosphere of the early 90s, a time when Phoenix was expanding at a breakneck pace, its highways stretching across the desert floor while its administrative resources were completely overwhelmed by a soaring population and a rising tide of urban crime. The investigation into Laura's disappearance was instantly caught in a bureaucratic paralyzation. The responding patrol units, working with the primitive tracking systems of 1991, treated the scene as a potential voluntary runaway for the first critical 48 hours, allowing the shifting desert winds and passing traffic to systematically obliterate any microscopic tire tracks or scent signatures left behind on the gravel driveway. When the case was finally elevated to the Homicide Division, under the command of a relentless investigator named Detective Frank Reyes, the trail had already turned cold. Reyes found himself staring at a complete forensic vacuum. There were no signs of a struggle inside the apartment, no threatening messages left on the analog cassette answering machine, and no foreign fingerprints on the exterior door handles of Laura's vehicle. The only anomaly was a single, vintage copper coin from the early 20th century resting directly on the driver's seat, a strange, deliberate psychological marker left behind by a calculated predator who moved with an eerie, total confidence in the dark. The discovery of that coin shifted the internal narrative of the investigation from a missing person inquiry into a terrifying pursuit of a meticulous serial offender, but the search was instantly choked by a total lack of actionable intelligence and the technological blind spots of the era. Detective Reyes spent weeks unspooling Laura's inner circle, conducting exhaustive interrogations of her colleagues at the firm, her former college classmates, and the regular patrons of the quiet diner where she spent her lunch hours. Every lead collapsed into a dead end. The police databases of 1991 could not cross-reference regional crimes with automated efficiency, leaving Reyes blind to similar abductions occurring across the state lines in Nevada and New Mexico. The neighborhood was paralyzed by intoxic, creeping paranoia. Families locked their doors before the sun touched the horizon. Outdoor lights were left burning through the night, and a heavy, defensive silence settled over the blocks surrounding Camelback Mountain as the blistering Arizona summer gave way to a long, agonizing winter of unanswered questions. The structural paralysis of the department deepened as the years rolled into decades, transforming Laura's disappearance into a legendary ghost story whispered in the corridors of the precinct. The original cardboard evidence containers were moved from the active lockers to the high, dusty shelves of the long-term storage repository in downtown Phoenix, forgotten artifacts of a bleeding era. Detective Frank Reyes retired in the early 2000s, his private journals filled with meticulous hand-drawn maps of the desert terrain and an unyielding sense of personal failure that haunted his final years. Laura's family slowly disintegrated under the crushing weight of the unknown. Her father passed away within 5 years of her disappearance, his heart broken by the absolute silence, while her mother retreated into a reclusive, silent life, leaving Laura's childhood bedroom completely undisturbed, a dusty, sun-faded time capsule of 1991 that stood as a permanent accusation against a city that had failed to protect her. But the science of the future was quietly evolving inside the sterile, climate-controlled laboratories of a new generation of forensic specialists, waiting for the moment when the analog mistakes of the past could be corrected by the digital precision of modern molecular biology. In the summer of 2026, the newly formed Phoenix Cold Case Task Force, operating under a federal mandate to deploy next-generation scanning tools to unresolved regional homicides, pulled the Vance dossier from its resting place. They focused their offensive not on hunting for aging witnesses whose memories had been fractured by time, but on the microscopic testimony trapped on the surface of that vintage copper coin. In 1991, the coin had been dusted with standard charcoal powders, a primitive technique that failed to yield a classifiable print from the cold, uneven metal surface. The artifact had been sealed inside an airtight preservation pouch, insulated from the external environment for 35 years, holding its secrets intact across a generation of human history. The historic breakthrough did not occur with a dramatic arrest or a televised press conference. It materialized in the middle of a graveyard shift as an automated sequence completed on a high-definition sequencing monitor inside the state crime lab. Technicians utilized an advanced forensic process known as contact-free laser-induced fluorescence mapping, revolutionary methodology capable of projecting specialized light wavelengths to detect the subsurface residue of microscopic amino acids and ancient skin oils trapped inside the grain of the stamped metal. The laser didn't just illuminate the surface, it reconstructed a pristine, multi-layered digital rendering of a latent thumbprint that had been pressed into the copper coin 35 years ago. When the automated matrix ran the profile through the updated next-generation identification database, the software didn't return a statistical approximation or a collection of possibilities. It returned a definitive, unassailable match that pointed directly to Arthur Pendleton, a quiet, 68-year-old retired municipal surveyor who lived a completely unremarkable, blameless existence in a pristine retirement community in Scottsdale. The realization that the suspect was a respected, quiet member of the local community who had spent his entire adult life working inside the city's infrastructure planning departments sent a shockwave of profound horror through the task force. Pendleton had used his professional expertise as a surveyor to map the changing topography of the Phoenix Valley during the massive expansion of the late 80s and early 90s, a position that granted him unrestricted, unsupervised access to the most isolated, remote sectors of the surrounding desert. For 72 hours, undercover surveillance units tracked his movements, watching as the silver-haired grandfather water his manicured desert landscaping, drive his luxury sedan to the local grocery store, and interact with his neighbors with an air of absolute, unblemished serenity. To the world, he was the model of a peaceful suburban retiree, but the behavioral analysts watching his every micro-movement saw a chilling undercurrent, a man who still checked his mirrors with a defensive, rhythmic obsession, a man who scanned the perimeter of his property every time the wind shifted, a man who had carried the suffocating weight of a childhood execution through every single day of his adult life. This brings us directly to the high-velocity execution of the Midnight Raid, a tactical operation designed to shatter 35 years of absolute security in a single, deafening heartbeat. The desert night is heavy and dark, a thick wall of dry heat lingering over the suburban cul-de-sac as a convoy of black, unmarked tactical vehicles creeps into position without headlights. Heavily armed state troopers and federal agents, wearing full-body armor and night vision optics, move across the crushed rock landscaping with the silent precision of phantoms, their weapons raised, their breathing disciplined. With a single, earth-shattering crash from a hydraulic breaching ram, the front door of the Scottsdale home is blown off its hinges, the interior instantly flooded by the blinding strobes of weapon-mounted lights and the roaring commands of tactical teams dominating the perimeter. Arthur Pendleton is pinned to his living room rug before his eyes can even adjust to the light, his wrists forced behind his back as the heavy steel handcuffs click shut, ending a flight from justice that had lasted nearly a half a century. As the sun begins to rise over the jagged peaks of the McDowell Mountains, casting a pale, crimson light across the yellow crime scene tape that now seals off the surveyor's residence, the news of the indictment rips through the state like an existential earthquake. The shockwaves are absolute, a profound institutional rupture for a city forced to confront the terrifying reality that the phantom they had hunted for 35 years was an employee of their own municipal architecture, a man who had used the official maps of the city to construct a shadow kingdom of violence. The legal battle ahead promises to be a complex, historic confrontation between the limits of human memory and the absolute, digital certitude of modern science, a trial that will drag the dark, obsessive secrets of 1991 back into the harsh glare of the public eye. But for the ghost of Laura Vance, and for a community fractured by a lifetime of unanswered questions, the long, suffocating night of BTAC is finally over, the silence of the desert replaced at last by the heavy, unyielding strike of a judicial gavel. The transition from the pristine suburbs of Scottsdale to the high-security processing wing of the Maricopa County Jail is a cold, systematic stripping away of the respectable identity Arthur Pendleton had spent 35 years constructing as a shield against his past sins. He stands under the harsh, buzzing glare of the fluorescent tubes inside the intake terminal, his civilian clothes replaced by a stiff, oversized bright orange jumpsuit that marks him as a high-profile state inmate. Two veteran cold case detectives step into the interrogation room, carrying a single, thick cardboard box bearing the original case numbers from October 1991. They do not begin with a barrage of shouted accusations. They understand that with a man like Pendleton, psychological dominance is achieved through the quiet, systematic presentation of unyielding data. They sit across from him at the polished steel table, the hum of the overhead recording cameras the only sound breaking the suffocating silence of the room. The lead detective slides a vintage photograph across the metal surface, a high-resolution print of Laura Vance captured just weeks before her disappearance, her bright smile lighting up a youthful face that has remained unchanged in the memory of the city for over 3 decades. Pendleton's eyes reflexively dart down to the image, his pupils contracting slightly, an involuntary physical reaction that is instantly captured by the high-definition lenses mounted in the corners of the ceiling. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the kindly grandfather slips, revealing a glimpse of the calculating, cold-blooded individual who had stood in the shadows of a Central Phoenix driveway 35 years ago, watching his target through the lens of a surveyor's transit. "Do you know who this is, Arthur?" the detective asks, his voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion, the tone of a judge delivering an inevitability rather then an inquiry. Pendleton clears his throat, his voice a raspy, dry whisper that sounds like dead leaves scraping across concrete. I see the news. I know what this is about. But you've got the wrong man. I'm a retired public servant. I worked 30 years for the city. I've never been arrested in my life. I don't know that girl, and I don't know anything about a disappearance from 1991. The defense is practiced, delivered with a flat, rehearsed monotony that suggests he had envisioned this exact conversation 1,000 times during his sleepless desert nights, preparing a wall of suburban respectability to shield himself from the blood on his hands. But the detectives do not blink. Instead of arguing against his denial, the investigator opens the cardboard box and pulls out a large, transparent evidence envelope containing a pristine, digital magnification of the vintage copper coin. The image is massive, displaying the intricate, labyrinthine patterns of human skin ridges mapped out by the contact-free laser sequencing, overlaid with a series of bright green digital markers that isolate specific bifurcations and sweat pore distributions. Next to it, they place a copy of Pendleton's modern fingerprint profile, taken during his routine background check for municipal pension verification. This print on the left, the detective says, pointing to the green markers, was extracted from the inner grain of the coin found on the driver's seat of Laura's car in October 1991. For 35 years, Arthur, your skin oils were trapped inside that copper weave, preserved perfectly from the desert heat like a fossil in stone. In 1991, our systems couldn't read a partial print on a textured metal surface. Today, our automated digital matrices map over 200 separate ridge characteristics simultaneously. The software doesn't make mistakes, Arthur. It performed a point-by-point architectural match against your profile. The probability of this print belonging to anyone else on this planet is 1 in 80 billion. You were in that car, Arthur. You left your signature behind on that seat, and you walked away with Laura. The silence that follows the detective's words is heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Pendleton's jaw tightens, the skin around his mouth turning a pale, sickly gray as the clinical certainty of the science begins to systematically demolish his wall of denial. He looks away from the chart, his eyes fixing on the stark white wall, refusing to engage with the visual proof of his undoing. He realizes that his entire life, his decades of public service, his reputation as a quiet neighbor, his peaceful retirement, has just been rendered completely irrelevant by a microscopic pattern of oil and sweat that he had carelessly left behind on a piece of metal when he was 33 years old. While the high-stakes psychological warfare intensifies inside the interrogation room, the city outside is waking up to an absolute media firestorm that is ripping through the local communities like a tornado. The morning news broadcasts lead with a shocking announcement of the arrest, the anchors' voices laced with a mixture of disbelief and urgency as they read the details of the breakthrough. Phoenix 1991 cold case solved. Anonymous tip finally breaks 35-year silence. In the neighborhood where Laura had disappeared, residents stand on their porches in the early morning air, watching as a fleet of unmarked police vehicles and forensic vans surround the surveyor's property, sealing the entire area behind a perimeter of bright yellow crime scene tape. The older generation of residents, those who had lived through the terrifying autumn of 1991, are plunged into a sudden, vivid state of retrospective trauma. They remember the paralyzing fear that had gripped the valley after Laura vanished, the way parents refused to let their children play outside after dark, the frantic installation of high-end deadbolts and security lights on every home. For 35 years, they had lived under the assumption that the killer was a transient monster who had long since vanished into the vast, decaying landscape of the American West. Now, they're forced to confront the grotesque reality that the phantom was living among them the entire time, an employee of the city infrastructure, a man who smiled and waved at them across the lawn while carrying the memory of an execution in his heart. At the Phoenix Police Headquarters, the original investigative files are being systematically digitalized, revealing a dark, historical tapestry of a department that had been completely overwhelmed by the urban chaos of the early 90s. The 1991 logs describe a city on the brink of structural collapse, with homicide detectives carrying caseloads that defied human capacity, forcing them to abandon critical leads in favor of immediate, active emergencies. Frank Kowalski, the original lead detective who had spent his life haunted by Laura's disappearance, had passed away in a veteran's hospital 5 years prior, his private journals filled with sketches of the copper coin and notes about an investigation that had broken his spirit. Current investigators review his old notes with a sense of profound reverence, recognizing that the modern breakthrough is built on the foundation of Kowalski's meticulous preservation of the physical evidence, a preservation that kept the killer's signature safe until the technology of 2026 could finally unlock it. Inside the interrogation room, the lead detective leans forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper that pierces through Pendleton's stoic silence. "We didn't just stop at the fingerprint, Arthur. Once the anonymous tip gave us your name, we unspooled your entire professional history from 1991. We looked at your land surveying logs for the Municipal Infrastructure Committee. Do you know what we found, Arthur? We found that in October 1991, you were assigned to map the remote, subterranean drainage vaults beneath the desert tracking grid north of the city. The exact location where an independent surveying crew just discovered a shallow grave hidden beneath the desert rock. You didn't just happen to find that hiding place, Arthur. You knew it existed because you had helped document its structural layout for the city." Pendleton's breathing becomes shallow, his chest rising and falling in rapid, jerky movements as the circumstantial evidence begins to interlock with the forensic science, forming an inescapable cage around him. He grips the edge of the metal table, his knuckles turning white, his mind frantically searching for a loophole, a defense, a lie that can survive the onslaught of data. But there is none. He is an old man, stripped of his armor, facing a new world that records everything, forgets nothing, and possesses the capability to reach back through the fog of time to demand a full accounting for the blood spilled in the dark. The psychological weight of the revelation is an absolute cataclysm, an existential rupture that shatters the town's trust in its own history, proving that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who hide in the woods, but the ones who blend perfectly into the mundane landscape of everyday life. As the detectives pack up their charts and prepare to transfer Pendleton to the high-security holding cells for his initial arraignment, the city of Phoenix faces a long, painful confrontation with its past, knowing that the ghost of 1991 has finally been dragged into the light, and that the long-delayed march toward absolute justice has officially begun. The morning of the formal arraignment arrives with a bleak, oppressive sky that matches the solemn gravity of a community forced to confront its own historical ghost. The Maricopa County Superior Court is surrounded by a dense network of security barricades, a phalanx of county sheriffs holding back a surging crowd of local residents, true crime investigators, and national media pools. When Arthur Pendleton is led into the well of the courtroom, a heavy, suffocating silence drops over the chamber. He wears a plain civilian suit, his posture straight, but his eyes fixed firmly on the defense table, completely refusing to look at the public gallery where Laura's surviving family members sit shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale monuments to an endurance that has outlasted a generation. The prosecutor takes the podium for the state, her voice carrying a cold, resonant authority that fills every corner of the stone hall. She reads through the criminal complaint with a clinical, unyielding precision that leaves no room for corporate positioning. The state of Arizona officially charges Arthur Pendleton with first-degree premeditated murder, kidnapping, and felony murder in connection with the October 1991 abduction and slaying of Laura Vance. As the details of the anonymous tip are read into the record, revealing that the caller provided the exact serial number of the vintage copper coin and the specific structural coordinates of the remote desert burial site, the sheer, cold-blooded calculation of the crime becomes undeniable. The defense attorney attempts to mount an immediate challenge to the state's aggressive posture, arguing that the anonymous tip constitutes a violation of procedural integrity and that a 68-year-old grandfather with a blameless record presents zero risk of flight. "My client has spent 30 years as a dedicated public servant," the lawyer states, gesturing toward the quiet figure sitting next to him. To incarcerate an elderly citizen without bond based entirely on an unverified telephone call and automated scanning of a 35-year-old artifact is an egregious overreach of judicial authority. But the prosecutor fires back instantly, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "The state is not prosecuting the retiree sitting at that table today, Your Honor," she declares, pointing a steady finger across the aisle. "We are prosecuting the 33-year-old predator who used his official position within the municipal architecture to target a young woman, execute her in the isolation of the desert, and conceal her body inside a subterranean drainage vault like a piece of industrial waste. He has successfully evaded the scales of justice for 35 years, living a life of comfort that Laura Vance was ruthlessly denied. He represents a supreme flight risk and an absolute danger to the integrity of this process. The state requests that he be held in administrative segregation without bail. The judge does not hesitate. With a sharp, final strike of his gavel, bond is officially denied. Arthur Pendleton is remanded into custody, ordered to be held behind a steel door until his formal trial commences. As the sheriff stepped forward to lead him out of the courtroom, his eyes briefly sweep past the front row of the gallery, his vacant gaze colliding for a fraction of a second with the tear-streaked face of Laura's mother. There is no remorse in his expression, no silent plea for forgiveness. There is only the flat, calculating detachment of an old operator who has finally run out of paths to run down. While the legal battle lines are drawn in downtown Phoenix, a massive secondary crisis is unfolding within the archives of the local municipal departments where Pendleton spent his career. The realization that an active, high-level homicide suspect managed to hide in plain sight for over 3 decades while utilizing his access to official state mapping data has triggered an unprecedented independent audit overseen by the Arizona Attorney General's office. A specialized team of digital forensic engineers and cold case analysts has locked down the old survey logs and infrastructure mapping records from the late 80s and early 90s, systematically reconstructing Pendleton's professional movements across the changing topography of the valley. The burning question hanging over the entire state legal establishment is a terrifying one. Was Laura Vance an isolated victim of a calculated obsession, or was Arthur Pendleton a prolific, shadow predator who used the vast, dense wilderness sectors of the Southwest as his personal hunting ground? Investigators begin mapping Pendleton's historical land survey assignments against a grim, regional database of unsolved disappearances and cold case homicides that occurred across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah between 1985 and 2005. They discover a pattern of chilling anomalies. During 3 separate periods when Pendleton was assigned to conduct extended, unsupervised wilderness surveys near the remote canyons of the northern border, 3 other young women vanished from nearby towns without a single trace. None of those cases were ever solved, their files sitting in the same dusty archives where Laura's case had languished for decades. The physical reality of the desert itself begins to take on a hostile, menacing tone for the residents of the valley. The vast, sun-bleached landscapes and the quiet, hidden concrete infrastructure that define the borders of outer Phoenix are no longer viewed merely as symbols of regional expansion. They are now recognized as the protective camouflage that allowed a killer to survive across generations. The neighborhood where Pendleton lived out his prosperous retirement is paralyzed by a collective sense of profound betrayal. Neighbors who had shared community association meetings with him, who had invited him to backyard barbecues, and whose children had played on his front lawn are forced to look back at their own history through a distorted, sickening lens. Every kind gesture he made, every smile he offered across the fence, is now stained by the realization that he was carrying the memory of an execution inside his chest every single day. Back in his concrete cell at the county jail, Arthur Pendleton is experiencing the brutal reality of an institution that does not care about his age or his municipal record. He is placed on a strict 23-hour lockdown schedule, isolated from the general inmate population for his own protection, as a 74-year-old cold case killer would be an immediate target for violence in any prison block. The space is tiny, a 6-by-9-foot box of reinforced concrete, a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow bunk that offers no comfort to his body. The continuous, Industrial hum of the ventilation system and the distant, mechanical clanging of heavy steel tier doors are the only sounds that penetrate his isolation. According to internal jail logs, Pendleton has entered a state of profound psychological retreat. He sits on the edge of his bunk for hours, his head bowed, his hands clasped between his knees, staring intently at the concrete floor as if he can see the ridges of his own fingerprint tracing their way across the stone. He refuses the standard jail meals, consuming only small amounts of water, his physical frame shrinking noticeably with each passing hour as the reality of his confinement begins to crush his spirit. Yet, whenever his defense team arrives in the secure attorney consultation room, the frailty instantly vanishes, replaced by a sharp, demanding precision as he reviews the copies of the digital forensic files, searching desperately for a single administrative flaw, a single broken chain of custody, a single legal technicality that can blow the state's case wide open before the trial can even begin. The upcoming trial will not just judge a man, it will put an entire era of a city's history under the microscope, testing whether modern forensic science can successfully reach back through the fog of 3 decades to deliver a definitive, thunderous conclusion. For the mother who spent 35 years looking out her window for a girl who would never return, the news is a devastating, world-shattering validation that brings no joy, only the heavy, exhausting reality of an ending. The legal war will be long, the media circus intense, but the circle of evidence has officially closed around the predator, leaving no room for escape as the state prepares to drag the dark secrets of 1991 into the unyielding light of absolute justice. The silence of the desert has been broken. The memory of Laura Vance has become the lever that pulls down the final wall of a monster's fortress, and the long-delayed march toward absolute accountability has officially commenced. The concrete vault of the Maricopa County Jail's high-security administrative segregation wing hums with a low, vibrating drone, a permanent acoustic baseline that walls off Arthur Pendleton from the scorching, triple-digit heat of the Phoenix afternoon. It is late October 2026. Through the narrow, mesh-reinforced glass slit positioned near the reinforced ceiling of cell 314, the desert sky is a hard, flat sheet of unblinking cobalt. Inside this space, the calculated, comfortable markers of the life Pendleton spent 35 years engineering have been utterly obliterated. There are no manicured desert landscapes, no golf club memberships, no luxury sedans, and no silver-framed photographs of a doting grandfather celebrating holidays with an unsuspecting family. There is only a single steel shelf, a concrete bunk slab covered by a flame-retardant vinyl mattress, and the unyielding, shadowless glare of a high-intensity fluorescent bulb that remains illuminated 24 hours a day, reflecting off the brushed stainless steel toilet and the cold, gray stone beneath his rubber-soled sandals. For a man who spent more than half of his natural life operating under the absolute, unshakable assumption that he had cleanly outsmarted the local homicide division, the state investigators, and the natural progression of time itself, this sudden, total reduction of physical space is a brutal psychological crucible. Pendleton sits with his spine pressed rigidly against the freezing concrete wall, his long, age-spotted fingers tracing the stiff, coarse seams of his bright orange inmate jumpsuit. For nearly a third of a century, his mind had been a fortified sanctuary, a secure vault where the memories of October 1991 were buried beneath layers of mundane municipal service, quiet suburban retirement, and community respectability. He had successfully convinced himself that the sheer velocity of the Phoenix Valley's rapid geographic transformation had erased his past. He believed that the concrete paving of old dirt roads, the commercial development of empty desert tracks, and the chaotic digital migration of old police archives had rendered him completely invisible to the scales of justice. But as he listens to the heavy, rhythmic pacing of the detention officers outside his heavy iron door, he is forced to confront a reality that cannot be negotiated. The modern legal system does not rely on analog memories or paper logs. It operates on data, on pixels, and on the unyielding, molecular permanence of next-generation forensic science. On the fixed steel table bolted directly into the center of his cell lies a massive, black 3-ring binder containing the state's preliminary discovery exhibit packet, a clinical, step-by-step documentation of his own architectural undoing. Pendleton opens the binder with a slow, agonizing precision, his eyes tracking the dense columns of laboratory charts, chemical breakdowns, and high-definition digital lifting reports. He does not read the pages as a frantic inmate searching for an emotional lifeline. He analyzes them with the hyper-focused, hypercritical gaze of a master municipal surveyor looking for a fatal structural vulnerability in an opponent's civil blueprint. For 30 years, his dominance in the regional planning departments was built entirely on his capability to locate the hidden blind spots in land contracts, to exploit the administrative oversight of zoning boards, and to utilize his deep understanding of municipal records to shape the narrative to his advantage. But as his fingers map the lines of this federal cold case dossier, he realizes that the language of advanced molecular sequencing contains no ambiguity, no administrative loopholes, and no room for financial or political leverage. The foundation of the state's prosecution, as detailed in the terrifyingly precise text before him, rests completely on the microscopic preservation of the vintage copper coin that had been discovered on the driver's seat of Laura Vance's abandoned car on that rainy October night in 1991. In the immediate aftermath of the abduction, the original detectives had been blinded by the physical chaos of the scene and the primitive fingerprinting technology of the era. They had dusted the cold, uneven metal surface with standard charcoal and aluminum powders, a volatile, analog process that failed completely to yield a classifiable series of skin ridges from the stamped, textured profile of the coin. The artifact had been labeled as a secondary exhibit, an unclassifiable relic that sat undisturbed inside an airtight preservation pouch within the county's long-term storage facility in downtown Phoenix. But the biological material didn't decay. In the summer of 2026, the Specialized Federal Task Force utilized contact-free laser-induced fluorescence mapping to penetrate the microscopic valleys of the stamped copper without altering the underlying physical matrix of the metal. The automated scanning sequence didn't just clean the image, it mapped the subsurface matrix of microscopic amino acids, lipid residues, and ancient skin oils that had been trapped inside the grain of the coin since the moment it was placed on that fabric seat. Pendleton's jaw tightens until his muscles ache as he stares at the massive digital magnification of his own thumbprint projected onto the center of the white page. The bright green digital markers isolating the matching ridge characteristics look like a coordinate grid, a permanent, inescapable map of a 1991 abduction that he had carelessly left behind when he was 33 years old. He remembers that stormy October night with a clarity that the passage of decades had never been able to diminish, no matter how many hours he spent meticulously constructing an alternative reality of public service. He remembers the thick, suffocating smell of creosote and damp desert earth as the rain began to hit the gravel driveway, the soft metallic click of the car door swinging open, and the cold weight of the copper coin as he deliberately placed it on the driver's seat, a private, obsessive gesture of dominance that he believed would remain an eternal riddle to the police. He had been so careful. He had worn heavy canvas gloves during the initial approach. He had avoided leaving tire tracks on the hard-packed rocky soil, and he had chosen a burial site so deep within a subterranean municipal drainage vault that it had remained completely hidden through 35 seasons of flash floods and desert heat. He had beaten the detectives of 1991 because their department was overwhelmed by an unprecedented urban crime wave and primitive tracking databases. But he had forgotten that science does not operate on an administrative clock, and that the microscopic grooves of a vintage coin would serve as an unyielding time capsule, holding his biological signature intact across a generation of human history until the world was finally ready to read it. While Pendleton remains locked inside the absolute, sterile silence of his cell, the city outside the prison walls is experiencing an unprecedented social and institutional rupture that is tearing through the quiet residential communities of the valley like an earthquake. The morning news broadcasts continue to dominate the airwaves with footage of the high-velocity midnight raid, the anchors' voices carrying a mixture of profound shock and urgency as they read the details of the shifting case. Phoenix 1991 cold case solved. Anonymous tip finally breaks 35-year silence. In the exclusive, pristine retirement developments of Scottsdale, where Pendleton had maintained his historical presence as a quiet, model neighbor, residents stand on their manicured desert lawns in the heavy heat, watching in paralyzed silence as a fleet of unmarked federal vehicles and state forensic units surround his property, sealing the entire executive home behind miles of bright yellow crime scene tape. The older generation of regional residents, those who had lived through the frantic, terrifying autumn of 1991, are suddenly plunged into a vivid state of retrospective trauma. They remember the paralyzing fear that had gripped every household after the young legal clerk vanished without a single cry or trace of forced entry, the immediate installation of advanced deadbolts and high-intensity motion lights, and the way parents began looking at every utility vehicle or city worker with defensive suspicion. For 35 years, they had comforted themselves with the clean, convenient narrative that Laura Vance had been the victim of a random, transient predator, a drifter passing through on the interstate who had targeted the valley by chance before vanishing back into the vast expanse of the American West. Now, they are forced to confront an institutional reality that is infinitely more grotesque. The monster wasn't an outsider lurking in the shadows of the highways. The predator was an employee of the city architecture itself, a trusted municipal surveyor who had used the official maps of the valley to construct a shadow kingdom of violence. At the Phoenix Police Headquarters, the original investigative notebooks of Detective Frank Kowalski are being systematically digitized by the Cold Case Task Force, revealing a tragic historical pattern of a department that had been completely blindfolded by the killer's proximity to the heart of the city's civil planning infrastructure. Kowalski's field notes from the autumn of 1991 describe a city on the brink of structural collapse, with homicide detectives carrying caseloads that defied human capacity, forcing them to rely on standard municipal employee logs to cross-reference vehicles seen near the perimeter of crime scenes. Because Pendleton possessed valid, high-level clearance as a city surveyor mapping infrastructure expansion near Camelback Mountain, his presence in the area was automatically filtered out by the primitive database algorithms of 1991 as routine municipal labor. He had utilized his official status to monitor the early boundaries of the active investigation, using his proximity to note where search teams were deploying and ensuring that his own absolute security remained undisturbed while the trail went cold. Inside the high-security consultation room of the jail, the state's lead prosecutor sits across from Pendleton's defense team, her face an unreadable mask of professional certitude. She doesn't offer room for negotiation or plea bargains. She simply places a secondary file on the metal table, her eyes locked on his lead counsel. "We didn't just stop at the fingerprint trapped in the coin, counselor," she says, her voice low, resonant, and entirely steady. "Once the contact-free laser mapping gave us Arthur's biological profile, we unspooled his entire professional logging history from October 1991. We looked at his field survey assignments for the municipal drainage expansion project north of the city grid. Do you know what we found? We found that in the exact week Laura Vance disappeared, your client signed off on the structural inspection of the remote, subterranean valve vault where an independent surveying crew just discovered her remains. He didn't just happen to find that hiding place, counselor. He knew it existed because he was the person who mapped its exact structural coordinates for the city engineering database." The defense attorneys do not speak immediately, their faces hardening as the circumstantial data begins to interlock with the molecular science, forming an inescapable chronological cage around their client. They realize that the very professional expertise that had protected Pendleton for 35 years, his mastery of regional maps, his official municipal status, his unblemished public record, has been converted into the primary engine of his destruction, providing the prosecution with a clear, undeniable line of physical access to the hidden geography of the crime. The narrative of a quiet, dedicated public servant is completely dead, replaced by a dark, clinical record of an obsession that had been hidden behind a city badge for over 3 decades, leaving the defense with no alternative but to launch a savage, scorched earth campaign to challenge the constitutional validity of the laser technology itself before the historic trial can even commence. As the daylight fades over the high concrete towers of the county jail, casting long, bloody shadows across the sterile corridors of the administrative segregation wing, the city of Phoenix faces a profound, lingering confrontation with its own historical ghost. The collective psyche of the community remains trapped in a state of suspended animation, a dark realization that the passage of time is no longer a guarantee of peace, and that the shadows of the past possess the capability to reach across more than 3 decades to drag the truth into the light, forcing an entire generation to answer for the betrayal they spent a lifetime trying to bury in the desert dirt. The quiet hours of the graveyard shift inside the Administrative Segregation Unit bring no relief to the terminal structural collapse of Arthur Pendleton's composure. The closed-circuit security monitors inside the guard station capture him sitting completely motionless on the edge of his narrow bunk at 3 a.m., his orange uniform top cast aside, his bare, weathered shoulders pressed against the freezing concrete wall as he stares intently at his own fingers. His lips are moving in a rapid, silent, and frantic mutter, a low, rhythmic recitation of surveyor coordinates, infrastructure numbers, and the specific desert turnoffs along the northern highway grid, a maddening loop of a memory that has finally transformed from his secret sanctuary into his permanent prison. He refuses to consume the standard jail rations, his physical frame beginning to shrink noticeably under the intense, shadowless glare of the fluorescent light, the grandfather clock of justice ticking down the minutes until his opening statement, where the mask he wore for 35 years will be violently ripped away from his face forever. The prosecution team uses this final midnight window to finalize their master presentation, locking each piece of digital evidence into an airtight, interactive timeline that will leave no room for alternative explanations when the jury takes the box. They have built a comprehensive 3-dimensional digital model of the Phoenix metropolitan grid from October 1991, tracking the exact survey routes assigned to Pendleton to demonstrate the chilling physical proximity of the predator to his prey. Every document, every field log from the Municipal Drainage Committee, and every pixel of the laser-lifted print is cross-referenced with a specific minute on the historical grid, creating an inescapable net that will drag Arthur Pendleton from his pristine retirement estate directly to the absolute finality of a life sentence, without the possibility of parole. As the first winter fog of the changing season begins to roll over the jagged peaks of the McDowell Mountains, swallowing the desert floor in a cold, gray embrace, both sides prepare for the commencement of the full criminal prosecution, a historic confrontation where the illusions of a blameless public record will be weighed against the absolute certainty of modern molecular evolution, and where a family's 35-year night of unyielding agony will finally face its definitive, thunderous conclusion. The transition from the high-security administrative segregation wing of the Maricopa County Jail to the granite-clad chambers of the Maricopa County Superior Court in downtown Phoenix is a brutal, high-velocity plunge into the blinding glare of a modern media circus. It is a blistering July morning in 2026, and the historic plaza surrounding the municipal complex on West Jefferson Street has been completely transformed into a high-density television production village. A phalanx of county sheriffs and state troopers stands shoulder to shoulder behind heavy steel crowd control barricades, managing a surging, volatile crowd of local residents, legal analysts, and true crime reporters who have descended upon the Judicial Center to witness the official unmasking of a desert phantom. When the armored transport vehicle pulls into the secured underground Sally Port, the massive iron gate slams shut with an echoing, concussive boom that vibrates through the concrete foundation, a sound that marks the definitive end of Arthur Pendleton's physical liberty. He is led up the rear elevator in heavy ankle shackles, the rhythmic, metallic clinking of the iron chains sounding like a ticking clock, a stark contrast to the quiet, entitled footsteps he had taken through his pristine Scottsdale community just days earlier. Inside courtroom 5B, the atmospheric tension is heavy, the air conditioned to a sterile, freezing intensity that does not diminish the suffocating scent of wet pavement, nervous sweat, and collective anxiety. Every single oak bench in the public gallery is packed to its absolute physical capacity, leaving zero standing room. In the very front row, sitting with a rigid, heartbreaking posture, is Laura's surviving mother. Her fragile frame is wrapped in a dark shawl despite the external heat, her thin hands trembling as she clutches a small, sun-faded photograph of her daughter from 1991, her bright, ambitious eyes staring out at a room that had forgotten her for 35 years. When the side door opens and Arthur Pendleton is led into the well of the courtroom, a collective, audible gasp ripples through the crowd like a wave of electricity. Seeing him in the stark, oversized orange inmate jumpsuit, without his signature golf shirts or his clean retirement attire, strips away the last remnants of his respectable public servant persona. He looks shockingly smaller, an old man whose calculating mask has been violently peeled back, his gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood of the defense table, completely refusing to turn his head toward the gallery or the battery of cameras tracking his every micro-movement. The Superior Court judge takes the bench, the sharp, authoritative strike of his wooden gavel cutting through the low murmur of the room like a gunshot. The proceeding is a high-stakes legal exercise designed to formally establish the state's intent to prosecute a crime that has been frozen in time since the sweltering autumn of 1991. The lead prosecutor stands at the podium, her posture commanding, her voice carrying a cold, resonant authority that immediately fills the room. She does not begin with an emotional speech. She begins with a hard, clinical reading of the criminal indictment into the record. The words hit the silent room with a sickening, visceral force. The state of Arizona officially charges Arthur Pendleton with 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder, kidnapping, and felony murder in connection with the October 1991 disappearance and execution of Laura Vance. As the prosecutor reads through the newly uncovered forensic details, the point-by-point contact-free laser mapping of the latent print trapped inside the grain of the vintage copper coin, the structural mapping data tracking back to his municipal drainage logs, the sheer, cold-blooded calculation of the crime becomes undeniable. Arthur's lead defense attorney, a prominent, high-priced white-collar fixer, stands at his table, his voice booming through the courtroom sound system as he attempts to mount an immediate challenge to the state's aggressive posture. He argues for a reasonable bond, citing his client's total lack of a prior criminal record, his 30 years of dedicated municipal service to the city of Phoenix, and his deep, unchanging roots in the local retirement community. Mr. Pendleton is a highly respected public servant, the lawyer states, his hand gesturing toward the quiet, shaking figure sitting next to him. He has lived in the valley his entire life, raising a family and contributing to local civic organizations. To hold an elderly citizen without bond based entirely on a single piece of 35-year-old physical evidence that has sat in a dusty, unregulated storage locker for decades is an egregious violation of his constitutional rights. But the prosecutor fires back instantly, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that leaves zero room for compromise. The state is not prosecuting the peaceful retiree sitting at that table today, Your Honor, she declares, pointing a steady finger across the aisle. We are prosecuting the 33-year-old predator who used his official municipal authority to target a young woman, who breached her security in the dark, led her into the isolated expanses of the desert, and executed her with a single bullet to the back of the skull before concealing her remains inside a subterranean concrete vault like a piece of industrial debris. The evidence against this defendant is not a circumstantial theory. It is a permanent, digital molecular signature trapped inside the very metal of the coin he left behind as a twisted token of dominance. He has successfully evaded the scales of justice for 35 years, living a life of absolute peace that Laura Vance was ruthlessly denied, all while using his city pension to fund his comfort. He represents a supreme flight risk and a profound danger to the integrity of this historic process. The state requests that he be remanded into custody without bail. The judge does not hesitate. He reviews the confidential forensic reports and the infrastructure logs submitted by the Cold Case Task Force, his face an unreadable mask of solemn gravity. With a sharp, final strike of his gavel, bond is officially denied. Arthur Pendleton is remanded to the high-security wing of the Maricopa County Jail, ordered to be held in administrative segregation until his formal trial. As the sheriff stepped forward to lead him out of the courtroom, Arthur's eyes briefly sweep past the front row of the gallery, his cold, vacant gaze colliding for a fraction of a second with the tear-streaked face of Laura's mother. There is no remorse in his expression, no silent plea for forgiveness. There is only the flat, calculating detachment of an old operator who has finally run out of paths to run down. While the legal battle lines are drawn in downtown Phoenix, a massive secondary crisis is unfolding within the historical archives of the local municipal departments and the corporate records of the infrastructure facilities where Arthur spent his youth. The realization that an active, high-level homicide suspect managed to hide in plain sight for over 3 decades while leveraging his family's access to the city's civil engineering blueprints has triggered an unprecedented, independent audit overseen by the Arizona Attorney General's office. A specialized team of modern forensic analysts and cold case investigators has locked down the old surveying logs and infrastructure mapping records from the late 80s and early 90s, systematically digitizing thousands of old log sheets, field clearings, and municipal project records. The burning question hanging over the entire state legal establishment is a terrifying one. Was Laura Vance an isolated victim of a calculated obsession, or was Arthur Pendleton a prolific, shadow predator who used the vast, dense wilderness areas surrounding the southwestern desert networks as his personal hunting ground? Investigators begin mapping Arthur's personal land tracking history against a grim, historical database of unsolved disappearances and cold case homicides that occurred across the region between 1985 and 2005. They discover a pattern of chilling anomalies. During 3 separate periods when Arthur's engineering team was surveying isolated, rural parcels of land near the remote mountain ranges and desert valleys, parcels that were subsequently cleared for massive municipal water grids, 3 other young women vanished from nearby towns without a trace. None of those cases were ever solved, their files sitting in the same dusty archives where Laura's case had languished for decades. The physical geography of the desert itself begins to take on a hostile, menacing tone for its residents. The vast, sun-bleached landscapes and the quiet, hidden concrete infrastructure that define the borders of outer Phoenix are no longer viewed merely as symbols of regional expansion. They are now recognized as the protective camouflage that allowed a killer to survive across generations. The neighborhood where Arthur lived out his prosperous retirement is paralyzed by a collective sense of profound betrayal. Neighbors who had shared community association meetings with him, who had invited him to exclusive backyard barbecues, and whose grandchildren had played on his front lawn are forced to look back at their own history through a distorted, sickening lens. Every kind gesture he made, every smile he offered across the fence, is now stained by the realization that he was carrying the memory of an execution inside his chest every single day. Back in his concrete cell at the county jail, Arthur Pendleton is experiencing the brutal reality of an institution that does not care about his age or his long municipal record. He is placed on a strict 23-hour lockdown schedule, isolated from the general inmate population for his own protection, as a high-profile cold case killer would be an immediate target for violence in any prison block. The space is tiny, a 6-by-9-foot box of reinforced concrete, a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow bunk that offers no comfort to his body. The continuous, industrial hum of the ventilation system and the distant, mechanical clanging of heavy steel tier doors are the only sounds that penetrate his isolation. According to internal jail logs, Arthur has entered a state of profound psychological retreat. He sits on the edge of his bunk for hours, his head bowed, his hands clasped between his knees, staring intently at the concrete floor as if he can see the ridges of his own thumbprint tracing their way across the stone. He refuses the standard jail meals, consuming only small amounts of water, his physical frame shrinking noticeably with each passing hour as the reality of his confinement begins to crush his spirit. Yet, whenever his defense team arrives in the secure attorney consultation room, the frailty instantly vanishes, replaced by a sharp, demanding precision as he reviews the copies of the digital forensic files, searching desperately for a single administrative flaw, a single broken chain of custody, a single legal technicality that can blow the state's case wide open before the trial can even begin. The legal war ahead promises to be an absolute vivisection of a city's historical infrastructure, exposing the terrifying ease with which a badge of public service can cloak the most monstrous actions. As the evening sun sinks below the jagged horizon, casting long, crimson shadows over the dark expanses of the Arizona desert, the city of Phoenix waits in a state of paralyzed suspense, knowing that the ghost of 1991 is no longer a silent memory and that the scales of justice are finally grinding toward a definitive, thunderous conclusion. The concrete vault of the Maricopa County Jail's administrative segregation wing remains completely insulated from the shifting seasons of the Arizona desert, maintaining a cold, mechanical hum that serves as a permanent acoustic baseline to Arthur Pendleton's total confinement. It is late July 2026, and the scorching external air cannot penetrate the reinforced steel thresholds where the 74-year-old retired municipal surveyor sits. Inside cell 314, the mundane details of a life built on absolute respectability and quiet civic service have been utterly erased. There are no landscaped desert gardens, no neighborhood association meetings, and no corporate planning charts of the Phoenix metropolitan expansion. There is only a fixed stainless steel shelf, a concrete bunk slab, and the unyielding glare of a security bulb that leaves no corner of the stone room in darkness. For a man who spent 35 years operating under the total, unquestioned assumption that he had cleanly outsmarted both the local homicide department and the natural progression of time, this sudden reduction of physical space is a brutal psychological crucible. Pendleton sits with his spine pressed rigidly against the cold stone wall, his gaze fixed on the thick, black discovery binder that represents the state's sudden forensic offensive. For nearly a third of a century, his memory had been a carefully managed ledger, a private sanctuary where the events of October 1991 were buried beneath layers of routine public labor and quiet suburban retirement. He had successfully convinced himself that the vast, rapid geographic transformation of the Phoenix Valley had rendered him completely invisible to the scales of justice, that the paving over of old dirt roads, the construction of massive master-planned communities, and the digital migration of old police databases had broken the connection between his hands and the blood spilled in the dark. But as he listens to the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of the detention officers pacing the tier outside his heavy iron door, he is forced to confront a reality that cannot be negotiated. The modern legal system does not rely on analog memories or paper records. It runs on data, on pixels, and on the unyielding molecular permanence of modern forensic science. Pendleton turns the pages of the discovery packet with a slow, agonizing precision, his eyes tracking the dense columns of laboratory charts, chemical breakdowns, and contact-free laser mapping diagnostics. He analyzes the text not as an inmate facing the terrifying reality of a life sentence without parole, but as a master surveyor searching for a structural vulnerability in an opponent's civil blueprint. For 3 decades, his success within the city planning departments was built entirely on his capability to locate the hidden blind spots in land contracts, to exploit the bureaucratic oversight of municipal boards, and to utilize his deep understanding of official records to manipulate the narrative. But as his fingers map the lines of this federal cold case dossier, he realizes that the language of advanced molecular sequencing contains no ambiguity, no administrative loopholes, and no room for financial or political leverage. The foundation of the state's prosecution, as detailed in the clinical text before him, rests completely on the microscopic preservation of the vintage copper coin that had been discovered on the driver's seat of Laura Vance's abandoned vehicle on that rainy night in October 1991. In the immediate aftermath of the abduction, the original detectives had been blinded by the physical chaos of the storm and the primitive tracking systems of the era, focusing their primitive testing on charcoal dustings that failed completely to yield a classifiable series of skin ridges from the stamped, textured profile of the coin. The artifact had been labeled as an unclassifiable relic, sitting undisturbed inside an airtight preservation pouch within the county's long-term storage facility in downtown Phoenix. But the biological material didn't decay. In July 2026, the Specialized Federal Task Force utilized contact-free laser-induced fluorescence mapping to penetrate the chemical layers of the metal without altering the underlying physical matrix of the stamped copper. The automated scanning sequence didn't just clean the image, it mapped the subsurface matrix of microscopic amino acids, lipid residues, and ancient skin oils that had been trapped inside the grain of the coin since the moment it was placed on that fabric seat. Arthur's jaw tightens until his muscles ache as he stares at the massive digital magnification of his own thumbprint projected onto the center of the white page. The bright green digital markers isolating the matching ridge characteristics look like a coordinate grid, a permanent, inescapable map of a 1991 abduction that he had carelessly left behind when he was 33 years old. He remembers that stormy October night with a clarity that the passage of decades had never been able to diminish, no matter how many hours he spent meticulously constructing an alternative reality of public service. He remembers the thick, suffocating smell of creosote and damp desert earth as the rain began to hit the gravel driveway, the soft metallic click of the car door swinging open, and the cold weight of the copper coin as he deliberately placed it on the driver's seat, a private, obsessive gesture of dominance that he believed would remain an eternal riddle to the police. He had been so careful. He had worn heavy canvas gloves during the initial approach. He had avoided leaving tire tracks on the hard-packed rocky soil, and he had chosen a burial site so deep within a subterranean municipal drainage vault that it had remained completely hidden through 35 seasons of flash floods and desert heat. He had beaten the detectives of 1991 because their department was overwhelmed by an unprecedented urban crime wave and primitive tracking databases. But he had forgotten that science does not operate on an administrative clock, and that the microscopic grooves of a vintage coin would serve as an unyielding time capsule, holding his biological signature intact across a generation of human history until the world was finally ready to read it. While Pendleton remains locked inside the absolute, sterile silence of his cell, the city outside the prison walls is experiencing an unprecedented social and institutional rupture that is tearing through the quiet residential communities of the valley like an earthquake. The morning news broadcasts continue to dominate the airwaves with footage of the high-velocity midnight raid, the anchors' voices carrying a mixture of profound shock and urgency as they read the details of the shifting case. Phoenix 1991 cold case solved. Anonymous tip finally breaks 35-year silence. In the exclusive, pristine retirement developments of Scottsdale, where Pendleton had maintained his historical presence as a quiet, model neighbor, residents stand on their manicured desert lawns in the heavy heat, watching in paralyzed silence as a fleet of unmarked federal vehicles and state forensic units surround his property, sealing the entire executive home behind miles of bright yellow crime scene tape. The older generation of regional residents, those who had lived through the frantic, terrifying autumn of 1991, are suddenly plunged into a vivid state of retrospective trauma. They remember the paralyzing fear that had gripped every household after the young legal clerk vanished without a single cry or trace of forced entry, the immediate installation of advanced deadbolts and high-intensity motion lights, and the way parents began looking at every utility vehicle or city worker with defensive suspicion. For 35 years, they had comforted themselves with the clean, convenient narrative that Laura Vance had been the victim of a random, transient predator, a drifter passing through on the interstate who had targeted the valley by chance before vanishing back into the vast expanse of the American West. Now, they are forced to confront an institutional reality that is infinitely more grotesque. The monster wasn't an outsider lurking in the shadows of the highways. The predator was an employee of the city architecture itself, a trusted municipal surveyor who had used the official maps of the valley to construct a shadow kingdom of violence. At the Phoenix Police Headquarters, the original investigative notebooks of Detective Frank Kowalski are being systematically digitized by the Cold Case Task Force, revealing a tragic historical pattern of a department that had been completely blindfolded by the killer's proximity to the heart of the city's civil planning infrastructure. Kowalski's field notes from the autumn of 1991 describe a city on the brink of structural collapse, with homicide detectives carrying caseloads that defied human capacity, forcing them to rely on standard municipal employee logs to cross-reference vehicles seen near the perimeter of crime scenes. Because Pendleton possessed valid, high-level clearance as a city surveyor mapping infrastructure expansion near Camelback Mountain, his presence in the area was automatically filtered out by the primitive database algorithms of 1991 as routine municipal labor. He had utilized his official status to monitor the early boundaries of the active investigation, using his proximity to note where search teams were deploying and ensuring that his own absolute security remained undisturbed while the trail went cold. Inside the high-security consultation room of the jail, The state's lead prosecutor sits across from Pendleton's defense team, her face an unreadable mask of professional certitude. She doesn't offer room for negotiation or plea bargains. She simply places a secondary file on the metal table, her eyes locked on his lead counsel. "We didn't just stop at the fingerprint trapped in the coin, counselor," she says, her voice low, resonant, and entirely steady. "Once the contact-free laser mapping gave us Arthur's biological profile, we unspooled his entire professional logging history from October 1991. We looked at his field survey assignments for the municipal drainage expansion project north of the city grid. Do you know what we found? We found that in the exact week Laura Vance disappeared, your client signed off on the structural inspection of the remote, subterranean valve vault where an independent surveying crew just discovered her remains. He didn't just happen to find that hiding place, counselor. He knew it existed because he was the person who mapped its exact structural coordinates for the city engineering database." The defense attorneys do not speak immediately, their faces hardening as the circumstantial data begins to interlock with the molecular science, forming an inescapable chronological cage around their client. They realized that the very professional expertise that had protected Pendleton for 35 years, his mastery of regional maps, his official municipal status, his unblemished public record, has been converted into the primary engine of his destruction, providing the prosecution with a clear, undeniable line of physical access to the hidden geography of the crime. The narrative of a quiet, dedicated public servant is completely dead, replaced by a dark, clinical record of an obsession that had been hidden behind a city badge for over 3 decades, leaving the defense with no alternative but to launch a savage, scorched earth campaign to challenge the constitutional validity of the laser technology itself before the historic trial can even commence. As the daylight fades over the high concrete towers of the county jail, casting long, bloody shadows across the sterile corridors of the administrative segregation wing, the city of Phoenix faces a profound, lingering confrontation with its own historical ghost. The collective psyche of the community remains trapped in a state of suspended animation, a dark realization that the passage of time is no longer a guarantee of peace, and that the shadows of the past possess the capability to reach across more than 3 decades to drag the truth into the light, forcing an entire generation to answer for the betrayal they spent a lifetime trying to bury in the desert dirt. The quiet hours of the graveyard shift inside the administrative segregation unit bring no relief to the terminal structural collapse of Arthur Pendleton's composure. The closed-circuit security monitors inside the guard station capture him sitting completely motionless on the edge of his narrow bunk at 3 a.m., his orange uniform top cast aside, his bare, weathered shoulders pressed against the freezing concrete wall as he stares intently at his own fingers. His lips are moving in a rapid, silent, and frantic mutter, a low, rhythmic recitation of surveyor coordinates, infrastructure numbers, and the specific desert turnoffs along the northern highway grid, a maddening loop of a memory that has finally transformed from his secret sanctuary into his permanent prison. He refuses to consume the standard jail rations, his physical frame beginning to shrink noticeably under the intense, shadowless glare of the fluorescent light, the grandfather clock of justice ticking down the minutes until his opening statement, where the mask he wore for 35 years will be violently ripped away from his face forever. The prosecution team uses this final midnight window to finalize their master presentation, locking each piece of digital evidence into an airtight, interactive timeline that will leave no room for alternative explanations when the jury takes the box. They have built a comprehensive 3-dimensional digital model of the Phoenix metropolitan grid from October 1991, tracking the exact survey routes assigned to Pendleton to demonstrate the chilling physical proximity of the predator to his prey. Every document, every field log from the Municipal Drainage Committee, and every pixel of the laser-lifted print is cross-referenced with a specific minute on the historical grid, creating an inescapable net that will drag Arthur Pendleton from his pristine retirement estate directly to the absolute finality of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. As the first winter fog of the changing season begins to roll over the jagged peaks of the McDowell Mountains, swallowing the desert floor in a cold, gray embrace, both sides prepare for the commencement of the full criminal prosecution, a historic confrontation where the illusions of a blameless public record will be weighed against the absolute certainty of modern molecular evolution, and where a family's 35-year night of unyielding agony will finally face its definitive, thunderous conclusion. The suffocating, relentless heat of the Arizona desert possesses a unique ability to distort reality, creating shimmering mirages on the asphalt and baking the landscape into a silent, unyielding monument to forgotten things. But inside the subterranean basement of the Phoenix Police Department headquarters, isolated entirely from the blistering sun and the passage of the seasons, the atmosphere is defined by a different kind of cold, mechanical stagnation. It is here, in the windowless, climate-controlled command center of the Cold Case Task Force, that the ghosts of the city are cataloged in endless rows of towering steel filing cabinets and secure digital servers. For 35 years, the file bearing the name Laura Vance had existed in this fluorescent purgatory, a tragic administrative echo of a brilliant life violently extinguished in the autumn of 1991. The detectives who manned this division were accustomed to the maddening silence of the dead. They were trained to navigate the digital static, the dead-end leads, and the psychic tips that led to empty patches of desert dirt. But nothing in their decades of institutional experience could have possibly prepared them for the catastrophic, high-velocity rupture that occurred on a quiet, sweltering Tuesday morning at 3:14 a.m., when the secure, unlisted line of the cold case hotline suddenly illuminated the dark room with a single, blinking red light. The digital recorder engaged with a soft, electronic click, capturing an audio file that would instantly shatter a 3.5-decade illusion of safety, tear the mask off a respected municipal servant, and trigger the most aggressive forensic offensive in the history of the American Southwest. The voice that echoed through the high-fidelity monitoring speakers of the command center was not the trembling, hesitant whisper of a guilty conscience, nor was it the frantic, breathless panic of a sudden witness. It was a completely synthetic, digitally altered frequency, processed through layers of heavy cryptographic distortion that stripped away all recognizable human cadence, leaving behind a cold, robotic monotone that sounded like it was broadcasting from the bottom of the ocean. But it was not the terrifying acoustic quality of the voice that caused the night shift dispatcher's blood to freeze in his veins. It was the chilling, hyper-specific precision of the data being transmitted. The anonymous caller did not offer vague suspicions or generalized geographical theories. The voice delivered a clinical, unyielding sequence of operational coordinates that struck the heart of the 1991 investigation with the accuracy of a sniper's bullet. "You are looking for the remains of Laura Vance," the synthetic voice droned, the static crackling through the quiet basement room. "Do not search the open desert. Look beneath the municipal grid. Look inside the Salt River Project subterranean overflow system. Vault designation 4B Alpha, precisely 3 miles north of the Camelback boundary. And look at the copper coin left on her driver's seat. It is not a standard penny. It is a 1909 SVB Lincoln cent. He left his skin inside the copper weave. Look closely at the coin. He thought the metal would keep his secret, but the metal is holding his ghost." The playback of that specific, 54-second audio file sent an absolute, paralyzing shockwave through the entire hierarchy of the state law enforcement apparatus, instantly mobilizing a task force that had been trapped in a state of suspended animation since the Bush administration. The sheer magnitude of the caller's knowledge was terrifying because it breached the ultimate defensive wall of homicide investigations: hold back evidence. When Laura Vance was abducted from her quiet residential driveway, the original detectives had strictly embargoed the specific details of the crime scene from the media, releasing only the make and model of her abandoned vehicle. The public was never informed about the vintage copper coin resting on the driver's seat, let alone its exact numismatic classification as a rare 1909 SVB Lincoln cent. Only the killer, the original crime scene technicians, and the absolute highest echelon of the homicide command staff knew about that macabre, psychological calling card. The realization that an anonymous, untraceable entity possessed this intimate, classified knowledge meant only one thing. The caller was either the predator himself engaging in a twisted, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, or it was someone living inside his immediate, unblemished inner circle, a silent observer who had finally stumbled upon the dark, hidden trophies of a monster and decided to pull the trigger from the shadows. Within hours of verifying the holdback evidence, a massive, heavily armed, and highly specialized logistical convoy departed from the downtown precinct under the cover of darkness, rolling out into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the northern desert grid. The tactical excavation team, accompanied by structural engineers and forensic anthropologists, utilized the exact coordinates provided by the anonymous tip to locate the forgotten municipal overflow system, a massive, subterranean concrete labyrinth that had been designed to channel catastrophic flash floods away from the expanding Phoenix Valley in the late 80s. The entrance to Vault 4B Alpha was buried beneath decades of drifting sand, hardened creosote roots, and illegal dumping, invisible to anyone who did not possess the specific civil engineering blueprints of the era. As the heavy hydraulic excavators and industrial jackhammers tore through the desert crust, shattering the heavy concrete seals that had locked the chamber in absolute darkness for 35 years, the temperature inside the deep, claustrophobic tunnel plummeted, replacing the scorching heat of the surface with a chilling, stagnant scent of dry earth and ancient decay. The forensic recovery operation inside the concrete vault was a grueling, agonizing descent into a masterfully engineered tomb. Utilizing advanced ground-penetrating radar, the technicians scanned the thick concrete floor of the drainage chamber, detecting a distinct, human-sized anomaly buried beneath a secondary layer of poured aggregate that did not match the original municipal construction specifications. As the team painstakingly chipped away the false floor under the glare of high-intensity halogen work lights, the terrifying reality of Arthur Pendleton's calculated genius was exposed to the world. Buried beneath the stone, wrapped in heavy layers of industrial-grade synthetic canvas and secured with thick municipal utility cables, were the skeletal remains of Laura Vance. The preservation within the dry, oxygen-deprived concrete casing was chillingly absolute. The medical examiner's preliminary, on-site assessment immediately confirmed a precise, tactical execution via a single, small-caliber ballistic wound to the base of the skull. There was no chaos, no frantic disposal, no shallow desert grave left to the mercy of scavenging coyotes. It was a permanent, structural integration of a human body into the very foundation of the city's architecture, executed by a man who possessed the official authority, the equipment, and the unfettered access required to turn a massive public works project into his own private, invisible cemetery. The unearthing of the subterranean tomb and the subsequent extraction of the laser-lifted fingerprint from the vintage copper coin formed an impenetrable, dual-layered forensic trap that instantly elevated the anonymous tip from a cryptic phone call into the deadliest weapon in the state's judicial arsenal. But as Arthur Pendleton sat within the freezing isolation of his high-security cell in the Maricopa County Jail, the realization that he had been brought down by an anonymous betrayal began to completely fracture his meticulously constructed psychological armor. The closed-circuit cameras tracking his every movement captured a man descending into a state of paranoid, obsessive torment. He did not pace the floor in anger over the laser technology. He paced the floor muttering the names of his family members, his former colleagues, and his closest neighbors. Who had made the call? Who possessed the digital sophistication to mask their voice through encrypted Eastern European proxy servers? For 35 years, Pendleton had believed that his mask of a quiet, philanthropic grandfather was completely impenetrable. Now, the terrifying truth gnawed at his sanity. Someone he smiled at across the dinner table, someone he bought birthday presents for, or someone who slept under his own roof had discovered the dark, bloody truth of his existence and had chosen to orchestrate his total annihilation with a single, untraceable transmission. Recognizing the devastating legal power of the anonymous caller, Arthur Pendleton's high-priced white-collar defense team launched an immediate, ferocious, scorched-earth legal counteroffensive aimed directly at the constitutional validity of the tip. On a blindingly bright Thursday morning, the grand, granite-clad chambers of the Maricopa County Superior Court became a high-stakes constitutional battlefield. Richard Sterling, Pendleton's lead counsel, stood before the judge, his voice booming through the heavy, tense atmosphere of the courtroom as he filed a massive, multi-volume motion to suppress the entirety of the state's evidence. Sterling argued with explosive, theatrical aggression that the anonymous tip was a textbook violation of the Fourth Amendment, a faceless, unverified digital phantom that had been illegally utilized by the state to bypass standard probable cause requirements. Your Honor, the government is attempting to execute an elderly, decorated public servant based on the digitally manipulated whispers of a complete ghost. Sterling shouted, gesturing wildly toward the prosecution table. They cannot produce this witness. They cannot cross-examine this machine. To allow an anonymous, untraceable voice to direct a multi-million-dollar excavation of municipal property and trigger the invasive, molecular scanning of an archived artifact is the ultimate manifestation of fruit of the poisonous tree. If the tip is unconstitutional, the vault discovery is unconstitutional, the laser fingerprint scan is unconstitutional, and this entire, media-driven circus must be dismissed immediately. But the lead prosecutor for the state, a veteran litigator whose cold, resonant authority had commanded the courtroom since the indictment, was fully prepared for this exact constitutional assault. She stepped to the podium, her posture unyielding, and delivered a masterful, surgical counterargument built entirely upon the legal doctrine of inevitable discovery. The defense's attempt to hide behind the anonymity of the caller is a desperate maneuver to blindfold this court to the absolute, scientific reality of the defendant's guilt, she stated, her eyes locking directly onto the judge. The anonymous tip was not the sole foundation of this investigation. It was merely a catalyst that accelerated a process already set in motion by the federal task force. We have submitted documented grant approvals showing that the contact-free laser-induced fluorescence mapping of the 1991 evidence box was scheduled and fully funded weeks before the call was ever received. We would have found the fingerprint on that coin, regardless of the tip. Furthermore, the caller did not manufacture the remains of Laura Vance. The caller simply pointed to a municipal vault that Arthur Pendleton, the defendant himself, officially logged and signed off on during his 1991 infrastructure surveys. The evidence does not stem from a poison tree. It stems from the defendant's own arrogant, systematic integration of a murder into his official city workload. The tip is legally sound, the discovery is absolute, and the biometric signature is undeniable. The tension in the courtroom reached a suffocating, unbearable crescendo as the judge reviewed the towering stacks of legal precedents, forensic timelines, and federal grant documentation. For Eleanor Vance's surviving family members, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the front row of the gallery, the silence was an agonizing extension of a 35-year nightmare, a terrifying possibility that a legal technicality could allow the monster who slaughtered their daughter to walk back into the sunlight. But the gavel finally struck with a heavy, definitive crack that echoed off the limestone walls. The judge denied the defense's motion to suppress in its entirety, ruling that the holdback evidence verified the caller's credibility and that the federal grant timeline securely established the inevitable discovery of the laser-lifted print. The anonymous tip would remain the central pillar of the state's narrative. The forensic findings were officially locked into the trial record, and Arthur Pendleton's desperate, high-priced attempt to erase his own history was completely and totally obliterated. With the legal firewall successfully fortified, the Cold Case Task Force immediately pivoted their operational focus to unmasking the identity of the digital phantom who had broken the case wide open, executing a massive, secondary search warrant on Pendleton's pristine, multi-million-dollar estate in Scottsdale. If someone in his inner circle had made that call, they had to have physical access to the artifacts of his crimes. Heavily armed agents and forensic technicians swarmed the property, tearing through the immaculate desert landscaping, the custom-built mahogany cabinetry, and the pristine, temperature-controlled garage. The search was meticulous, obsessive, and driven by the terrifying hypothesis that Pendleton was not a one-time offender. Ground-penetrating radar units were swept across the polished marble floors of his private study, eventually detecting a massive, dense anomaly buried directly beneath the foundation of his customized, built-in wooden desk. It took a team of specialized locksmiths and structural technicians over 4 hours of brutal, high-intensity drilling to breach the heavy tungsten steel reinforced doors of the hidden floor safe, But when the heavy metal finally gave way, the discovery inside sent a wave of absolute, paralyzing horror through the entire federal and state apparatus. The vault was not filled with cash, municipal bonds, or retirement portfolios. It was a meticulously organized, climate-controlled archive of a prolific shadow predator. Inside the dark recess of the safe, investigators found a wooden display box containing a collection of vintage coins, each one sealed in its own plastic slip, identical to the 1909 copper penny left on Laura's seat. Beside the coins lay a master set of the original 1991 Phoenix municipal drainage blueprints, heavily annotated in Pendleton's own handwriting, with thick red circles drawn over highly specific, isolated subterranean vaults across the valley. But the most devastating, soul-crushing discovery was a small, locked metal lockbox pushed to the very back of the safe. When agents pried it open, they found a stack of 6 different driver's licenses, yellowed and fading with age, belonging to 6 different young women who had vanished without a trace from the highways of Arizona, Nevada, and Utah between the years of 1985 and 2005. The unearthing of the hidden safe completely fundamentally altered the entire scope of the Phoenix 1991 cold case, transforming it from a localized, tragic homicide into a sprawling, multi-state pursuit of an apex serial killer who had successfully utilized the vast, unchecked expansion of the American Southwest as his own private hunting ground. The anonymous tip had not just found Laura Vance, it had inadvertently cracked open a massive, dark kingdom of violence that had remained entirely invisible to the world for decades. The realization that Pendleton had sat in his quiet study, drinking coffee and reviewing his municipal pension, while his victims' identities were locked in the concrete beneath his feet, pushed the community into a state of profound, existential shock. The illusion of the safe suburban enclave was utterly destroyed, replaced by the terrifying certainty that the most dangerous monsters do not lurk in the shadows of the deep desert. They build the very roads we drive on, they map the very cities we live in, and they smile at us from across the manicured lawns of our own neighborhoods. As the blazing Arizona sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting a bloody, crimson light across the sprawling metropolis of Phoenix, the walls surrounding Arthur Pendleton closed in with absolute, inescapable finality. The anonymous tip, the laser-lifted fingerprint, the unearthing of the subterranean tomb, and the horrifying contents of his hidden floor safe had interlocked to form a flawless, unyielding chain of evidence that stripped away his decades of deception, leaving him completely exposed to the thunderous judgment of the court. The defense was out of maneuvers. The state was armed with the unassailable power of modern molecular science, and a city that had spent 35 years mourning a ghost was finally prepared to drag its darkest, most elusive predator into the harsh, unforgiving light of a full criminal trial, demanding an absolute reckoning for the blood spilled in the silent desert night. The total defeat of Arthur Pendleton's pretrial motions within the stone chambers of the Maricopa County Superior Court marks a violent, irreversible acceleration in the state's multi-decade pursuit of absolute justice. It is late August 2026, and the suffocating, heavy atmospheric weight of a deep desert summer hangs low over the Phoenix Valley, turning the city into a vast, shimmering oven of cracked asphalt and dry, unyielding earth. Inside Courtroom 5B, the cold air conditioning hums against the external heat, maintaining a sterile, silent intensity that matches the grim clinical calculations unfolding within the well of the court. The defense table is a chaotic, deflated landscape of scattered legal briefs, multi-volume binders, and overturned notebooks, the silent remains of a high-priced white-collar defense campaign that has just been completely shattered by the unyielding intersection of modern molecular science and inevitable discovery protocols. Richard Sterling stands stiffly at his table, his posture rigid, his hands resting heavily on his leather briefcase as he attempts to steady his breathing following the devastating judicial decree. The theatrical bravado that had defined his constitutional assault on the anonymous tip is entirely gone, replaced by the grim, hyper-focused demeanor of a veteran litigator who realizes that his client's decades of protective privilege have just been permanently liquidated. He does not look at Arthur Pendleton, who sits frozen in his Navy civilian suit just inches away, his silver hair catching the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent chandeliers. Sterling knows that the refusal of the court to suppress the anonymous hotline call, the unearthing of the subterranean drainage vault, and the extraction of the laser-lifted print from the 1909 copper coin has effectively locked his client inside an airtight chronological trap from which there is no escape. For Arthur Pendleton, the formal judicial order binding him over for a full criminal prosecution under first-degree premeditated murder charges is an absolute psychological cataclysm. The mask of the kindly, blameless grandfather and dedicated municipal surveyor remains frozen on his weathered face, a stoic monument of denial, but his physical frame has shrunk noticeably after weeks of self-imposed isolation and starvation within his concrete segregation cell. He stares straight ahead at the flaking plaster behind the clerk's desk, his eyes wide, vacant, and glazed with an internal terror that screams through his veins. The realization that his entire adult life, his 30 years of public service, his pristine retirement estate in Scottsdale, his carefully curated reputation as a pillars of suburban respectability, has been utterly wiped out by a 54-second encrypted phone call is a reality that his mind can no longer safely process. The walls of his multi-decade fortress have not just cracked, they have completely collapsed into the dirt, burying his freedom beneath a mountain of digital pixels and unyielding chemical matrices. Across the central aisle, the prosecution team moves with the cold, quiet precision of a tactical unit preparing for a final assault. The lead prosecutor stands at her podium, her face an unreadable mask of professional certitude, her eyes scanning the jury selection sheets submitted by the county pool. She does not waste a single second celebrating the binding order. She understands that a preliminary hearing requires only a baseline demonstration of probable cause, while a full criminal trial before 12 citizens demands an absolute, seamless narrative architecture that can survive a continuous, scorched earth defense campaign. With the judge's signature officially authorizing the indictment, her office shifts its operational tempo from an investigative review into an aggressive, multi-layered preparation for the ultimate courtroom collision. Outside the municipal complex on West Jefferson Street, the news of the judge's ruling hits the media village like an explosive physical blow, triggering an immediate frenzy of high-velocity broadcasting that rips through the local communities like a tornado. National Pool reporters vault from their oak benches inside the gallery, their leather shoes clattering violently against the hardwood floors as they race toward the rear exit doors, desperate to be the first to deliver live updates to the satellite trucks waiting on the sun-bleached plaza. Within minutes, the screaming headlines dominate the digital news feeds across the state of Georgia and the American Southwest. Phoenix 1991 cold case solved. Judge denies defense motions. Surveyor to stand trial for murder. The collective psyche of the city is plunged into a state of intense, hypersaturated anticipation. The historic tragedy of Laura Vance suddenly transformed from a frozen ghost story into the most prominent legal confrontation of the modern era. For Laura's surviving mother, sitting rigidly in the front row of the public gallery, the sharp, definitive strike of the judge's wooden gavel is a moment of profound, world-shattering validation that leaves her gasping for breath. She drops her head into her thin, trembling hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she lets out a ragged, silent torrent of tears, a release of a psychological weight she has carried through 35 seasons of suffocating silence and institutional neglect. She tightly clutches the sun-faded photograph of her daughter against her chest, her fingers tracing the edges of the plastic frame as if she can shield Laura from the grotesque reality that is being systematically unspooled inside the courtroom. For over 3 decades, she had walked past the police precinct with her head down, a reclusive ghost mourning an unresolved mystery. Today, the modern world has reached back through the fog of time to pull her daughter's killer out of the shadows, validating an endurance that has outlasted a generation of human history. As the armed county sheriff stepped forward to lead Arthur Pendleton back out of the courtroom, the mechanical clinking of his heavy steel ankle shackles creates a sharp, industrial rhythm that echoes off the limestone paneling of courtroom 5B. He rises slowly, his movement stiff, his gaze remaining fixed on the floor to avoid the battery of television lenses tracking his every micromovement or the burning, furious eyes of the Vance family. When he passes through the heavy, reinforced side door into the secured holding corridor, the iron latch clicks into place with a definitive, echoing boom that marks his permanent exit from the world of the free. He is no longer an elite retired civil servant balancing a municipal pension. He is a high-profile state inmate, property of the Maricopa County Department of Corrections, waiting for the scales of justice to grind down the remaining minutes of his life. With the legal boundaries of the trial firmly established by the court, the Specialized Federal and State Cold Case Task Force shifts its operational focus to a massive secondary phase that threatens to rewrite the criminal history of the entire region. Operating out of a secured, windowless operations room within the Phoenix FBI field office, a team of digital forensic engineers and behavioral analysts is working around the clock to completely unspool the implications of the discoveries made inside Pendleton's Scottsdale home safe. The unearthing of the hidden floor safe beneath his custom mahogany desk has transformed the investigation from a localized pursuit of a single cold case murder into an active, multi-jurisdictional dragnet targeting one of the most prolific, elusive shadow predators in the history of the American West. The analysts are focused entirely on the 6 different driver's licenses recovered from the locked metal lockbox pushed to the very back of the safe, fading, yellowed pieces of plastic belonging to 6 young women who had vanished without a trace from the highway corridors of Arizona, Nevada, and Utah between the years of 1985 and 2005. A team of federal financial investigators begins cross-referencing the historical dates of those disappearances with Pendleton's official municipal survey logs, expense receipts, and private land tracking files from the late 80s and early 90s. The results that populate their high-definition digital mapping screens are an absolute nightmare of circumstantial and geographic alignment, revealing that in every single instance of those 6 cold case disappearances, Pendleton had been officially assigned by the City Infrastructure Committee to conduct extended, unsupervised wilderness surveys near the exact highway exits and remote canyon territories where the victims were last seen alive. The structural precision of the killer's operational profile is terrifying to the behavioral analysts watching the data lines interlock on the screens. Pendleton had weaponized his official status as a municipal surveyor, utilizing his authorized access to the city's developing water grids, subterranean drainage networks, and civil engineering blueprints to turn the vast, expanding infrastructure of the Southwest into his own private, invisible hunting ground. He didn't have to worry about leaving tire tracks or being questioned by patrol units in remote desert sectors. His official city vehicle, his orange safety vest, and his high-level civil clearances provided him with the perfect, unquestioned camouflage to target vulnerable travelers, execute them in the isolation of the wilderness, and permanently integrate their identities into the hidden concrete foundations of a rapidly growing metropolis. As the federal task force prepares to deploy heavy drilling equipment and forensic excavation units to the 6 newly identified infrastructure sites circled in red ink on Pendleton's archived maps, a profound, sickening wave of horror rolls over the quiet residential communities of the Phoenix Valley. The neighborhood where Arthur had lived out his prosperous, blameless retirement is completely paralyzed by a collective sense of existential dread. Neighbors who had shared community association meetings with him, who had invited him to backyard barbecues, and whose children had played on his manicured lawn are forced to look back at their own history through a distorted, terrifying lens. Every kind gesture he made across the fence, every soft-spoken conversation about desert landscaping, and every smile he offered to passing families is now stained by the realization that he was carrying the memory of an industrial slaughterhouse inside his chest every single day, his retirement funded by a city pension that he had secured while mapping the graves of his victims. Back inside the high-security administrative segregation wing of the county jail, the absolute, clinical isolation of his concrete vault is beginning to exert a slow, corrosive toll on Arthur Pendleton's psychological composure. The human mind, no matter how cold, calculating, or detached from empathy, cannot survive the sudden, simultaneous exposure of all its hidden graves without experiencing a terminal structural collapse. The internal jail logs reveal that Pendleton has completely ceased consuming his standard rations, his physical body shrinking noticeably under the intense, shadowless buzz of the 24-hour fluorescent bulb. The closed-circuit security lenses capture him sitting completely motionless on the edge of his narrow bunk at 3 a.m., his orange uniform top cast aside, his bare, weathered shoulders pressed against the freezing concrete wall as he stares intently at his own long fingers. His lips move in a rapid, silent, and frantic mutter, a low, rhythmic recitation of surveyor coordinates, infrastructure numbers, and highway markers that sounds like a map being read in the dark, a maddening loop of memory that has finally transformed from his secret sanctuary into his permanent, unyielding prison. As the calendar pages turn toward the final days of August, the prosecution team files its amended exhibit list with the Superior Court, a multi-volume narrative masterpiece that binds the physical geography of Phoenix to the hidden graveyards of the desert through the absolute certitude of modern molecular evolution. Every document, every field log from the 1991 Infrastructure Committee, every frame of the contact-free laser mapping visualization, and every artifact recovered from the Scottsdale floor safe is locked into a master chronological matrix from which there is no legal escape. The stage is officially set for the commencement of the full criminal trial, a historic, cinematic confrontation where a golden public servant's mask will be permanently ripped away from his face, where a city's 35-year night of unyielding terror will finally face the unyielding light of absolute justice, and where the memory of Laura Vance will become the definitive lever that pulls down the final wall of a monster's fortress. The legal battle over the state's newly amended exhibit list reaches a boiling point on a fiercely contested Tuesday morning in early September 2026, as a sudden, violent autumn dust storm slams across the Phoenix Valley, turning the desert sky an ominous, bruised shade of crimson and rattling the heavy glass partitions of the municipal center. Inside courtroom 5B, the air conditioning struggles against the external sandstorm, creating a cold, pressurized, and static-charged atmosphere that magnifies the immense tension vibrating through the packed chamber. The defense table has been converted into a veritable fortress of paperwork, stacked high with multi-volume motions, architectural diagrams, and procedural objections. Richard Sterling stands before the Superior Court judge, his posture rigid, his voice booming through the courtroom's high-fidelity speakers with a sharp, combative edge that signals a desperate, rearguard defensive operation. He paces the length of the wooden bar, his hands gesturing emphatically toward the crowded public gallery as he launches a direct, frontal assault on the expanding scope of the prosecution's narrative strategy. Your Honor, what the state is attempting to execute within this chamber is not a fair trial. It is a highly calculated, prejudicial ambush designed to completely incinerate my client's constitutional rights. Sterling declares, his fist slamming onto the hardwood table. We were brought into this courthouse to defend against a single, localized cold case accusation from 1991, a charge built entirely on a highly controversial, algorithmic laser reconstruction of a partial fingerprint trapped on a vintage coin. But now, just weeks before a jury is set to take the box, the government has dumped an entirely new multi-state conspiracy dossier onto this table. They are attempting to introduce materials recovered from a residential floor safe, old licenses, archived mapping logs, and speculative links to unresolved cases across 3 different states, cases that have absolutely zero legal or geographic connection to the tragic disappearance of Laura Vance. They are deliberately trying to paint Arthur Pendleton as a widespread mythological monster, a nomadic shadow predator, solely because they know their core forensic science cannot withstand the scrutiny of an objective cross-examination. This is a textbook violation of procedural due process, an intentional poisoning of the record, and we are demanding an immediate, absolute suppression of any exhibits that fall outside the strict boundaries of the original 1991 indictment. But the lead prosecutor for the state remains completely unswerved by the defense's display of righteous indignation. When she steps to the podium to deliver the government's response, her movements are smooth, deliberate, and entirely devoid of theatricality. She places a heavy, bound memorandum of law on the wooden stand, her eyes locking directly onto the judge with a cold, professional certitude that instantly lowers the temperature of the room. She utilizes a comprehensive, point-by-point architectural analysis to demonstrate that the newly uncovered evidence is not an arbitrary accumulation of unrelated crimes, but a systematic, interlocking manifestation of a single, continuous criminal methodology. The defense is intentionally mischaracterizing the structural integrity of the state's evidence because they are terrified of the complete picture it reveals, Your Honor. The prosecutor responds, her voice low, resonant, and vibrating with an unyielding authority. We are not introducing these exhibits to confuse the jury or to create a sensationalist sideshow. We are introducing them beneath the established legal doctrine of modus operandi and common design. The materials recovered from the defendant's Scottsdale floor safe, specifically the annotated municipal infrastructure maps from 1991 and the vintage coin collection, are inextricably linked to the mechanics of the crime committed against Laura Vance. The state's digital mapping experts will demonstrate that the red circles drawn on those civil engineering documents correspond precisely to the location of Vault 4B Alpha, the exact subterranean concrete drainage vault where Laura's remains were systematically concealed beneath a layer of poured aggregate. Furthermore, the presence of those 6 out-of-state driver's licenses inside the very same locked vault box establishes a chilling, definitive pattern of behavioral identity and trophy preservation. Arthur Pendleton did not operate in a vacuum. He utilized his official status as a municipal surveyor, his safety vest, his state vehicle, and his high-level civil clearances to turn the developing public works projects of the Southwest into his own private, invisible cemetery. To separate these exhibits from the core trial would be to blindfold the jury to the clinical, operational reality of how this predator survived in plain sight for 35 years. The evidence is legally sound, the nexus is absolute, and the public has a right to see the entire truth unmasked. The Superior Court judge takes less than 48 hours of intense deliberation behind closed doors to issue his written ruling. The defense's motion to suppress the amended exhibit list is denied in its entirety. The court rules that the items recovered from the Scottsdale residence are highly probative of the defendant's specialized knowledge, his unique access to hidden municipal structures, and his distinctive behavioral signature, allowing the prosecution to integrate the terrifying discoveries into their master courtroom presentation. It is a massive, terminal tactical disaster for Richard Sterling's firm, effectively demolishing their ability to isolate the trial to a narrow debate over laboratory calibration protocols, and ensuring that Arthur Pendleton will be forced to stand trial not just as a local cold case suspect, but as an unmasked, prolific shadow predator whose entire career was a shield for nomadic slaughter. With the evidentiary perimeter successfully secured, the Specialized Cold Case Task Force accelerates its operational preparation for the trial's most critical human element, the direct testimony of Walter Briggs, the 81-year-old retired airport refueling technician whose long-forgotten memory holds the key to the state's behavioral timeline. In a highly classified, secured conference room at the Phoenix FBI field office, prosecutors and digital mapping specialists sit around a massive digital display, analyzing the high-resolution, three-dimensional recreations of the DeKalb Peachtree Aviation Complex from the summer of 2003, the secondary logistical hub that the task force had unspooled during their parallel investigation into Pendleton's multi-state flight paths. The analysts are tracing a direct, undeniable line of material sourcing that bridges the geographical gap between the Arizona desert and the Midwestern industrial graveyards. They cross-reference the vintage gate logs verified by Briggs with a sequence of encrypted corporate fuel transactions executed by a commercial holding company linked directly to Pendleton's maternal grandfather's estate. The data reveals that on 3 separate occasions when Pendleton was logged operating his municipal survey equipment near the regional borders, his private aviation coordinates aligned perfectly with a series of late-night maintenance lockdowns at the private aviation hangar. It is a devastating, multi-layered revelation that shows how the killer systematically manipulated the overlapping transportation networks of the country to move his instruments of death, his vehicle, and his targets across state lines without ever triggering a single red flag on the analog tracking systems of a late 20th century. However, the defense team instantly recognizes that Walter Briggs represents a mortal threat to their remaining survival strategies. Within 72 hours of the judge's evidentiary ruling, a secondary team of private investigators and medical experts retained by Sterling's firm descends upon the quiet mountain town in North Carolina, where the elderly witness has spent his retirement. They systematically comb through his local pharmacy records, interview his neighbors at the senior center, and dissect his personal routine, searching desperately for any sign of cognitive distortion, age-related memory confabulation, or personal bias that can be weaponized during the cross-examination. They unearthed that Briggs had been treated for a minor transient ischemic attack in the spring of 2022, a medical detail that the defense immediately translates into an aggressive series of pretrial motions, characterizing him as a highly vulnerable, neurologically compromised witness whose memories have been artificially retrofitted and contaminated by the high-velocity media coverage surrounding the midnight raid. While the legal skirmishes over witness competency reach a crescendo in the judge's private offices, the financial forensic accountants achieve a parallel breakthrough that unearths a whole new layer of systemic corruption beneath Arthur Pendleton's public service history. By deploying advanced digital scanning tools to unspool the microfilmed bank records of his private Delaware holding companies from the mid-90s, they discover a sequence of cash deposits that occurred within 48 hours of each of the 6 out-of-state disappearances. The funds were not wired from standard accounts. They were systematically deposited through a network of untraceable automated teller machines located along the interstate highway corridors, always wrapped in rubber bands that bore the manufacturing stamps of the Phoenix Municipal Planning Department's logistics lockers. The implication of these long-forgotten cash flows sends a cold wave of profound, bone-chilling dread through the entire federal task force. They realized that Pendleton wasn't just working as an ordinary surveyor mapping the landscape of an expanding city. He was actively utilizing his official field assignments to log, observe, and exploit the movements of vulnerable individuals passing through the municipal infrastructure. He treated the highway exits, the rest stops, and the subterranean drainage networks as his private, invisible hunting ground, and he treated his official city salary and pension as the baseline funding for an ongoing, clinical itinerary of violence. The cold case is no longer just a localized search for closure for a single family. It has transformed into an active, multi-jurisdictional exposure of an institutional ghost who managed to turn the very tools of civil engineering into the weapons of a silent, nomadic executioner. Back in the quiet, pristine residential developments of Scottsdale, the atmospheric weight of the approaching trial is completely suffocating for the local residents. The manicured desert landscaping and the quiet, high-end cul-de-sacs where Arthur Pendleton had lived out his retirement are now viewed through a distorted, sickening lens. Fleet of news transmission trucks, documentary crews, and true crime podcasters sit permanently outside his empty estate, their high-definition cameras pointed at the custom wooden doors that had been blown off their hinges during the high-velocity midnight raid. The local residents deeply resent the invasive, sensationalist spotlight, yet they are trapped in an intense internal struggle to process the profound psychological trauma of the unmasking. Neighbors who had shared golf carts with him, who had invited him to backyard barbecues, and whose children had played on his front lawn are forced to look back at their own history with an overwhelming sense of revulsion, realizing that the soft-spoken grandfather who had offered them neighborly advice across the fence was a walking monument to a generation of missing young women, his hands stained with the blood of an industrial-scale slaughter. Inside the high-security administrative segregation unit of the Maricopa County Jail, the absolute, clinical isolation of Cell 314 is finally beginning to exert a visible, corrosive toll on Arthur Pendleton's psychological armor, even if his facial expression remains a frozen mask of stoic defiance during his brief, functional consultation meetings with his lawyers. The human mind, no matter how cold, calculating, or detached from empathy, cannot survive the sudden, simultaneous exposure of all its hidden graves without experiencing a terminal structural collapse. The internal jail logs reveal that Pendleton has completely ceased sleeping, his eyes remaining wide, vacant, and fixed on the ceiling through the long, freezing hours of the night. The closed-circuit security cameras capture him sitting completely motionless on the edge of his narrow bunk at 3 a.m., his orange uniform top cast aside, his bare, weathered shoulders pressed against the stone wall as he stares intently at his own long fingers. His lips move in a rapid, silent, and frantic mutter, a low, rhythmic recitation of surveyor coordinates, infrastructure numbers, and highway markers that sounds like a map being read in the dark, a maddening loop of memory that has finally transformed from his secret sanctuary into his permanent, unyielding prison. As the final calendar pages of September turn toward the formal commencement of jury selection, the prosecution team completes its master trial notebook, a digital and physical masterpiece of narrative engineering that binds the physical geography of Phoenix to the hidden graveyards of the southwestern desert through the absolute certitude of modern molecular evolution. Every document, every field log from the 1991 Infrastructure Committee, every frame of the contact-free laser mapping visualization, and every artifact recovered from the Scottsdale floor safe is locked into an unbreakable chronological matrix from which there is no legal escape. The stage is officially set for the commencement of the full criminal trial, a historic, cinematic confrontation where a golden public servant's mask will be permanently ripped away from his face, where a city's 35-year night of unyielding terror will finally face the unyielding light of absolute justice, and where the memory of Laura Vance will become the definitive lever that pulls down the final wall of a monster's fortress.